I'd been running US 2 east through the Upper Peninsula a few hours shy of dawn. Just me, the road, and that steady hush of tires on wet pavement. October air had the kind of chill that crept under the collar, and a mist had started that my wipers never fully cleared. Dispatch had me on pallets of dry goods for Sault Ste. Marie by morning. The weight rode fine, and the truck felt good. At 2:13 a.m., the night changed in a way I can't explain except to say the air felt thicker. The rain came in a fine, floating sheet in my headlights, and the smell shifted, like freezer burn and wet dog riding a cold draft through the vents. I did the usual, checked the windshield defog, cycled the heat, thinking maybe I'd picked up some swamp air off the Hiawatha National Forest. The first odd thing was the shadow that held with me on the right side of the road. I saw it when a guardrail broke and the forest pressed close. The beam hit trunks and brush, but something tall moved just inside the dark, a vertical shape keeping pace. I told myself, deer, because deer aren't tall like that. But your brain tries the most ordinary hook it can find. I eased off to the speed limit and kept my lane dead steady. The shadow kept coming. When there was a gap in the trees, I caught a clean angle, no more than a breath of time, and saw 2 amber points reflect in my light, set like a man's but with that canine shine. They didn't blink. They tracked. Then the trunk swallowed them again, and the road curved. I've heard plenty of truck stops, all the tall tales with coffee steam and cigarette smoke folded in, and I don't make a habit of adding to them. But I've also learned to respect the feeling in your hands on the wheel when the night goes wrong. I told myself to keep driving. The smell got stronger. There was a metallic edge to it, like blood dried into steel. The mist lifted and settled, and with each lift I'd get another hint of it running the tree line. My right mirror showed nothing, just black broken by my own rear lights and the suggestion of motion when rain streaks changed. A mile sign flashed past. 214. I planned to push to the next wide shoulder and stop to check the trailer. If I had a dragging strap or something flapping, that could explain a lot of noise and nerves. The last thing I needed was DOT trouble in the dark while hauling. I hit the hazards. The soft metronome of amber light began. When I routed to the shoulder, the sound came through the trailer skin, a slow, deliberate drag, like heavy rope pulled across aluminum. Not a rattle, not a thunk, a drag, the kind that makes you want to press your palms against your ears even when it's barely there under rain. I stopped. Brake air hissed. The engine idled with that steady diesel heartbeat. I set the brake, flipped the dome, and sat a second to listen. The drag sound stopped at once, as if my truck had been the instrument and the note died when I took my foot off the pedal. The forest pressed up close on the right, pines and wet undergrowth. On the left, 2 lanes of nothing, then woods again. Not another set of headlights either direction. My CB cracked with a static burst and went quiet. "All right," I said, because sometimes saying a thing keeps you moving. Flashlight, quick lap, back in the seat. I took the light and went down on the passenger side, keeping the beam just ahead of my boots. The rain had gone to mist, and the world felt muffled. The smell hit harder out there. Cold, rank fur and something rancid, like meat left in a freezer burn long enough to taste wrong when you thaw it. I checked the wiring on my trailer lights, the mud flaps, the tires. All good. Then I caught 3 long gouges on the aluminum near the rear door, parallel and deep enough to leave bright edges where the metal had folded. They were about as long as my forearm. No burrs like road scrape. No pattern like a tool. 3, deliberate. I crouched there too long, thinking how easy a vandal with a crowbar could fake marks, except the spacing was wrong for a crowbar and the arcs weren't human. I put my fingers close and felt the metal's cold bite. The gouges weren't old. You can tell when rain has rinsed something for hours. This hadn't. A sound came from above, a scrape across the trailer roof, then a soft thud toward the front, as if something heavy had shifted its weight. I stepped back and tilted the light up, but the beam died to a weak halo against the wet skin of the trailer and the black beyond. The sound didn't come again. Only my hazards ticked, a mild flash on the trees on the wet road, on my hand. I told myself, raccoon, black bear at worst. Sound carries strange off-metal. Then I saw the eyes again, across the road now, between two pines at a height that put them just above mine, though I was standing on the road crown. The beam picked them clean, amber, unblinking. The shape around them was wrong for a deer and wrong for a man. Shoulders too broad where my light clipped a triangle of fur, ears pointed and upright. A long line of snout suggested when the mist shifted. It stood there and watched me with a patience that cold goes through. The light trembled. I steadied it with both hands. "Hey," I said, the way you talk to a big dog you don't want to startle. "All right." It stepped once, quiet, and the eyes rose, taller, like it had lifted to stand on two legs. I'm not saying it did. I'm telling you the eyes rose in a smooth climb that put them above the trailer roof line in my angle. There was a soft pop, like knuckles flexed, carried in the damp air. I didn't run. I moved backward in clean steps and reached the cab with a calm I didn't deserve. The door opened with the loudest latch sound I've ever heard. I climbed in, shut it, and locked. The smells came with me on my clothes. The dome glowed the cab in a small circle. My hand stuttered once on the keys, then the engine turned and caught. I checked mirrors. Left, black, right, the shoulder and trees and my own orange pulse of hazard. Rear camera was nothing in that rain and dark. Before I put it in gear, something brushed the passenger window. Not a slam, not a strike. More like a hand drawing claws across glass with delicate pressure. The sound was a whisper of a thing, but it went into my teeth. A shape passed the corner of the windshield where the wipers couldn't reach. I saw the suggestion of fur matted in the wet, and the kind of breath you only see on powerlifters. Go, I told myself. So I did. I rolled slow, then faster. Hazards still ticking. Then I cancelled them and kept my hand steady at 10 and 2. The truck felt like a promise I could still keep if I didn't get clever. At 50, a pair of running shapes flickered in the tree line on my right, keeping pace for 100 yards. One got closer to the road and I felt that old prey shiver that doesn't ask your permission. Then the road offered me a gift, a passing rig in the opposite lane, high beams clearing the mist like a curtain for a second. In that swathe of white, I saw a tall, narrow chest and arms too long for any animal I know. Hands with length to the fingers instead of paws, and a head like a wolf that should not have fit that body. It turned into the light, and the eyes showed again, flat amber with a dog's sheen, human set in their forward stare. The flash passed, and the night closed. I pushed to 65, 70. The road opened. The smell thinned. The forest pulled back in long runs of low scrub, then wet meadow. My mirror picked up nothing but the stain of my own taillights. I kept the speed up for 20 miles and didn't breathe right until the lamps of Manistique bled the sky, and there was a 24-hour station with a lot big enough to feel like a crowd, even empty. I parked where the overheads gave me yellow islands of light. I did not get out. I called the non-emergency number and told the sheriff's office. I thought I'd seen a bear that needed watching. I didn't say what else. At first light, with people moving around like normal makes you brave again, I checked the trailer. The 3 gouges looked worse by day. In the wire of the fence behind the spot, 2 dark tufts of hair had snagged, coarse and long, not cow, not dog. A guy fueling his pickup wandered over, said, "You hit a cougar?" "Maybe," I said. When a deputy rolled through later, I gave the same maybe. He walked the line of the gouges with a gloved hand, nodded like mechanics do when they've already chosen the answer, and said, "Big cattle do that. Get curious." Mighty bold though, I'll file it. I signed where he told me, and went on to Sault Ste. Marie. I delivered on time. The warehouse guy said nothing about the marks. You can drive freight through anything if you keep all the doors shut. That night, in the sleeper, with the rain soft on the roof in a different town, I still heard the hush of claws across aluminum, and sometimes, quick, like a blink. The eyes in the mirror showed up in the corner of my vision, not blinking, patient as weather. I've had a lot of miles since. I don't stop on US 2 at night anymore. If I smell that cold, rank fur let in through a vent, I keep my foot where it belongs and let the road carry me out of there. People will say all kinds of things when they don't have to be there. I was there. I saw the marks. I saw the eyes. If you ever drive that stretch and the air turns to freezer burn and wet dog, don't stop. Keep moving. Morning will meet you if you let it. The old Halberd paper mill had been dark for 3 winters when I took the temp night watch job. They kept a couple of woodlots and chip silos on contract, while the county decided what to do with the place, which meant 1 guard with a badge that opened 2 doors and a radio that only reached the front gate shack. Most of the buildings were hollowed, steel ribs and concrete floors, and the yard lights threw that sodium orange that makes everything look older than it is. The first hour was wind and distant highway. You get used to the way a dead plant still talks, metal clicking as it cools, a length of chain tapping somewhere you can't find. I walked the wood yard, counted the pallet stacks, logged the fence line. The gravel crunched the same under my boots all the way to the southwest corner, where the chain link ran along a strip of birch and scrub pine. At 12:37 a.m., something tapped the corrugated wall behind me. Not a random tick. 3 taps, spaced just enough to be chosen. Tap, tap, tap. I turned and held light on a sheet of metal, dull orange from the yard lamp. No movement. The wind ran across the top seam and made the loose screws whisper. I told myself to keep the round, mark the time, and not give the night more attention than it earned. At 12:52, the taps came again. This time on the chip silo to my left, 30 yards off. Same 3 count, same calm spacing. The distance between the 2 spots was more than you'd cover with a tossed pebble, and there was no clink of anything thrown, just the knuckle sound of touch on steel. I keyed my radio. "Gate, this is yard. You copy?" Static. Then the guard at the front shack said, "Copy. Coyotes have been busy lately. Might be wind knocking something loose." "Roger," I said. "I'll check it." I walked the arc between wall and silo. Light held low. Wind carried sawdust smell and cold damp. The gravel told me when the weight outside the fence matched my pace. Heavy footfalls, not a 4-legged patter, but the slow, patient placing of weight you hear from a big man who isn't in a hurry. Only there wasn't a big man there. The sound stayed just beyond the light, out past the line where the sodium glow breaks into real dark, I stopped. The pacing stopped. I took 2 steps. 2 steps answered, crisp on the frozen gravel across the fence in the birch strip. "All right," I said, like you do with raccoons. "You go your way, I go mine." The 3 taps came a 3rd time. Different sheet metal now. Up on the loading bay awning behind me, like a hand had reached the underside and asked polite permission to come in. I moved to the shack by the chip scale and flipped the flood switch for bay 3. The light hit the lip of the loading dock, brightened damp concrete, and didn't make me feel better. The pacing started again, a slow half circle outside the fence, keeping my right side. Wind laid the birch leaves down in a silver stir, and every so often I caught a shape between trunks that wasn't a tree. Tall, narrow through the waist, wrong in the shoulders. I didn't chase it. I went inside bay 3 and waited, watching the rectangle of light on the yard. There's a way tired buildings hold sound, like they're listening back. The taps didn't come again for almost 20 minutes. When they did, they moved. South wall, then east, then the silo again. Each time 3, each time as if whatever was doing it wanted me to hear it without having to run. Just before 2 a.m., something collapsed a stack of pallets in the wood lot. It wasn't a rush or a crash like a car. It was that careful kind of push that gives way all at once, wood popping and sliding into itself. The front gate called lost picture on yard cam 2, then 3, then both came back in grain and static like snow. I said into the radio, "Got movement outside the fence. Might be a person." "Sheriff's 20 out if you want it," the shack said. I looked at the long line of dark beyond the last yard light and felt how the fence wouldn't stop much more than it would suggest a boundary. There was nothing on my side worth an officer at 2 in the morning. "Negative," I said. "I'll hold station and log it." The pacing kept to the fence. Every now and then, weight hit the chain link up high. Just a soft flex, the way something tall might test a boundary it could clear without much effort. The top rail groaned. The birch branches shifted back. At 2:31, I found the cairn. I'd gone out to recheck the pallet fall, and there it stood at the limit of the light, a small, deliberate stack where there hadn't been one, made of dog bones like you'd find in a butcher's discard, arranged kneecap to shin to femur, balanced careful enough that wind shouldn't have made it. The top piece was a pelvis set sideways like a little flag. No gore, no mess. Just cleaned, old bone, and the feeling that someone had put it there to see if I'd notice. I took photos with my phone and backed them to the gate shack's email from my post. It felt like planting a flag of my own against whatever the night wanted to insist on later. I went to the maintenance locker and pulled a bag of gypsum powder used for leaks. On the way back, I saw tracks in the yard's fringe where the gravel thins to sand. 2 by 2, long stride like a big dog running. But the spacing went wrong for any dog, and the depth in the cold sand said wait. I set gypsum in the clearest spots and misted it with my bottle. It took the shape clean. Pads, claws, no human boot near them. Around 3:10, the relief guard's headlights came up the access road. The pacing stopped. The birch strip held still like a photo. I walked him to the cairn and the casts, and we said all the sensible things 2 adults say when they don't want to join the club of people who believe the wrong stories. He nodded, pretending it was kids. I nodded too, grateful for pretending. At first light, I checked the top rail where the weight had pressed. It had a shallow bend to it, less than a knee, more than a raccoon. On the outside of the fence, the long stride printed again, veering off into scrub. I turned in my report with photos, casts, and notes. The plant manager read it with his jaw set and thanked me for being thorough. He said he'd have the pallets reorganized and the cameras serviced, and would I mind keeping the lights bright on the south yard for the next week. He didn't say the word coyote. He didn't say any other word either. That night at home, the sound of 3 taps kept finding my walls. First the water heater, then the back door, then a part of my mind that likes to test boundaries. I told myself what I tell newer guards: light what you can, document what you see, and don't make bargains with dark you can't keep. The mill was quiet when I came back on shift. The yard lights burned their old orange. The birch leaves whispered when the wind pushed. And somewhere beyond the edge of what the light could show, footsteps matched me for a few seconds, then decided I wasn't worth the trouble. The cabin sat just off a narrow logging road that turned to pack snow after the last turn. I was there to mind the place for a week, feed the wood stove, and keep an eye on a recuperating red-tailed hawk the rehab center had boarded in the outbuilding. The wind had a long, even voice through the ridge that made the eaves talk, and by 11, the flurries had picked up enough to turn the porch into a pale square. Inside, the stove ticked as it settled, the kind of friendly sound that keeps you company. I'd stacked kettle steam and a pile of paperbacks within reach, and let the battery lantern sit low on the table so the room felt dim and warm. Cell signal came and went in half bars. The porch motion light blinked once when the wind lifted, then steadied to dark again. Just before midnight, the floorboards on the porch creaked in a slow sequence. 2 boards near the rail, then 1 by the step, then the one that always spoke at the threshold. The motion light didn't come on. I told myself a branch had fallen and rolled, or maybe snow had slipped from the roof and shifted the wood. I turned down the stove damper, listened, and heard only wind. When I eased to the door and looked through the peephole, the porch was a soft grey stormlight from the sky, making the snow glow. No movement, no shadow. The wind breathed under the door and touched the hair at my wrist. Back in the chair, the creaking came again, the same line of weight across boards, as if something knew exactly which ones would answer. The motion light clicked and bloomed the porch in a muted circle. For a second, the glass fogged where my breath hit it, and I saw the old drips in the pane like veins. The light timed out. Dark again. I made tea. The hawk rustled once in the outbuilding and settled. The ridge wind kept its even note. At 12:26, the door latch clicked. Once. Not a full try. Just the sound a latch makes when a handle takes a hair of weight. Then again, a little firmer, the way a child might test a doorknob and think better of it. The boards near the threshold gave one long complaining sound and went still. I stood with the mug and told myself to breathe. The stove's glow laid a warm square across the door. In the silence that followed, something exhaled softly on the other side, a low huff that moved the warm air at the gap and brought a drift of cold to my socks. I felt it more than I heard it, like a slow bellows stroke. I slid the bolt, quiet, then set a chair under the knob because sometimes an old habit helps you sleep. I kept the lantern low and sat where I could see the sliver of light at the threshold. Snow dust moved there, a lazy migration under the door as the wind shifted. When the motion light tripped the next time, it did it in a clean, decisive way. Through the peephole, the porch board showed a scatter of snow, and, at the far edge near the post, an antler lay on its side like someone had set it down instead of dropping it. It wasn't dirty or chewed. One tine had a fresh scuff, pale where the outer coat had scraped. Something large stood just beyond the circle of light, where the snow glow turned to a deeper grey. You can tell the size of a thing by how it edits the world behind it. This had the height to hide the lower line of the rail, and the width to make the corner look wrong. I didn't see eyes. I didn't see teeth. I saw an absence with edges. The floorboard by the threshold answered again. Slow pressure and release. The door didn't move. The chair under the knob held its careful angle. The bolt sat true. The thing outside leaned close enough that his breath fogged the glass in a round, high circle. When the fog cleared, the outer pane showed a nose print that didn't fit a dog. Too high, too broad, a suggestion of a long bridge and narrow end like a wolf, but placed where a tall person's breath would be. I remembered reading once that cold carries smell and curiosity, both. I didn't speak. I let the room be what it was, a small, warm place with a locked door and a person who belonged to it for the night. After a time, it stepped away. The boards told me the path in reverse, the threshold plank, the one by the step, the two near the rail. The motion light went dark and the grey returned. Snow began to sift heavier, quieting the world into that hush it keeps for hours before dawn. I must have dozed. The generator on the property had a self-test at 3 a.m, a thing the owner had mentioned and I had filed away. When it came, it did so without drama. A gentle rise in sound, then the yard floods warming up and casting clean white onto the porch and the first stand of trees. In that new light, a shape moved through the edge of the yard. Tall, narrow through the waist, head carried forward in a way that made the shoulders seem wrong, like a runner with a too long stride slowing to a walk. It didn't look back at the cabin. It angled toward the tree line and let the trees take it. I waited until the floods timed out. I waited longer after that. When I finally opened the door near first light, the antler sat where I had seen it. Fine snow caught in the scuff. The latch plate had a slight bend where it met the strike. Not enough to fail, just enough to change a straight line into a suggestion of one. A few long, coarse hairs were caught in the weather strip near the bottom hinge, dark, hollow-centered when I held them to the lantern, like guard hair off something built for winter. The hawk blinked at me from the outbuilding, annoyed that I'd brought cold in on my boots. The ridge wind had gentled to almost nothing. I set the antler on the porch table because bringing it inside felt like crossing a line I didn't understand. I stayed the remaining days without trouble. The motion light behaved like a motion light again, lying to me about the wind, telling me the truth about a squirrel. On my last night, when the stove clicked and the house sighed, I listened for the long breath under the door and didn't hear it. Sometimes the forest comes to the edge of what's yours and reminds you that you're borrowing. Sometimes it leaves something to say it knows you're there. When I turned the keys back over in town, I mentioned the generator test had startled me. The owner laughed and said it startles everyone. He didn't ask about the bent latch. I didn't bring it up. The antler stayed on the porch table when I drove down the road, catching a little sun in the melt, like a sign that meant what it needed to for whoever looked. I like night miles in the shoulder seasons, when the campgrounds are half empty and the cold edge keeps the trail honest. The plan was a slow out and back above the Piedra, headlamp on low, pace easy. Turn at the third switchback past the Taylor slope where the spruce opened to aspen. The moon was thin enough that my beam mattered, the kind of night where your breath hangs and the river below sounds like it's talking to itself. The first odd thing was how quiet the Taylors felt. Rockfields have a way of answering your steps. even careful feet make small avalanches of sound. Tonight the stones under my line behaved, but somewhere above, on the darker half of the slope, something heavy settled without the usual cascade, like a weight had found exactly the right pocket and refused to announce itself. My watch ticked off a mile with a distance that wasn't right. GPS drifts in canyons, so I palmed the bezel and let the numbers be wrong without arguing. At the second switchback, I stopped to drink. The aspen there grow tall and straight, white columns with their eyes of bark. Somewhere up the bank a branch snapped at a height that would put it level with the top of the trail sign, 10 feet, maybe more. Not the dry pop of deadwood either. A green snap with resin in it, followed by a wet shine running down the pale trunk when I put my light on it. Something had torqued the living limb, not broken it for fall. Elk, I told myself. Big bulls do dumb, heavy things, but my headlamp didn't catch the bulk or sound of elk moving off. The night settled into the thin hiss of the river again. I turned at the third switchback and headed back toward the trailhead, planning to add a mile on the road if the watch shorted me. The wind shifted downhill. A small stone ticked onto the trail ahead of me from the uphill side and rolled to my shoe. Nothing above showed in my light. The rock didn't feel like gravity had gifted it to me. It felt like a suggestion placed where I couldn't ignore it. I ran a slow 50 yards. Another small stone came, this time to the left. Not a shower, not a slide. Single choices hitting the dirt with the kind of timing that a mischievous friend might think is funny on a dark night. The joke landed flat. Up at the talus again, a larger rock, not hand-sized but head-sized, had been set in the center of the trail, just where the tread narrows and you have to high-step. I hadn't passed it on the way up. The placement was deliberate, the way trail crews set a blocker to keep bikes off a sensitive section. Only this was fresh dust on a clean rock in a spot that took honest lifting. I swung the beam uphill. The slope answered with a shift and then absolute stillness, as if a big body had chosen one set of holds and wouldn't give me the kindness of a slide. A low chuff sounded from the switchback above. Canine, not cat, the way a big dog clears scent from its lungs. It came once, then the air went thin again. Bear hang, I said aloud, just to hear something human. Someone stashed food weird. The word didn't fit the way the night felt. I stepped around the placed rock and took the next turn without running, keeping my breathing easy. The trail there threads a spruce line, and the needles make a soft tunnel that holds sound. Halfway through, a little rock rattled off my right shoulder and kissed the trunk of a tree with a polite tap. I didn't put the beam there. I kept it steady on the tread because light has its own gravity, and if you start hunting the dark, you give it more country than it had. At the aspen where the green limb had twisted, resin was still bleeding, a clear gloss catching cold air. My light traced bruise marks in the bark, finger wide and set in a curve at a height I couldn't reach without a jump. Not claw furrows, not 3 gouges. More like something strong had tested the tree's give with a turn of the wrist. My watch buzzed a mile I hadn't earned. I ignored it. The trailhead lamp showed through the trees at last. A low sodium glow near the vault toilet and a parked sedan. The world changed a little in that proximity way places do when other people are near. I let myself believe the last 100 yards would be simple. From the slope above, a single stone came down with more intent. A palm-sized thing that landed in front of my toes, not thrown hard, just chosen. Then a second, closer to my left boot. I stopped because moving made me part of its timing. The air had a cold metal taste like the inside of a tin can. On the switchback above, That low chuff came again, patient. A car alarm chirped by accident. Someone at the trailhead bumping a key fob. The lights on the sedan hopped once, a quick flash. In that heartbeat of light, the spruce cut a new silhouette on the far edge. Tall through the chest, too narrow at the waist, head forward like it hung from a long neck and powerful shoulders. It wasn't a cat. It wasn't a man. My light picked nothing true. The flash had done all the work and taken the picture with it. The alarm chirped again, this time on purpose, because whoever was there had hit the key twice in surprise. The shape above shifted, and the talus finally gave itself away in a quiet spill of stones. No rush, just the sound of weight leaving careful holds for safer ground. I didn't run. I walked the last bend with my spine behaving like it wanted to shrink. The couple by the sedan looked at me, then past me, the way people do when they feel watched. The man laughed too loud and said, "Big deer tonight," in a voice that wanted an answer from someone who knew more. I said, "Must be," and didn't offer the rock on the trail as Exhibit A. When I reached the signboard, the alarm did its quick, apologetic beep as the trunk opened. The car's dome light made an island of ordinary. Whatever had been on the slope chose the other side of the ridge, moving away with a scatter of grit I could barely hear. I hiked back up in the morning, because daylight is a dare I can meet. The head-sized rock sat where it had, light dust fallen on its upslope face. On the aspen, the resin had skinned over into amber. In the talus dust above the switchback, one print held like a story half told, pads deep, claw marks clean, and behind the outer toe, a small crescent where a dew claw might have kissed down. No boot marks near it, no elk hock. I left the rock where it was. Trail crews would curse it and move it properly when they found it. I touched the aspen's resin without meaning to, and it stringed to my glove like sugar. The river below kept saying whatever a river says that sounds like a person if you stay long enough. I didn't stay. There are nights built for company, and there are nights that would rather you moved along. If you sit on a northern lake late enough, the noises start to sort themselves. Boats hum and fall to memory. Loons trade the last calls of the night. Frogs braid a soft chorus along the reeds, a wet, contented thrum that makes you feel like the world is running as it should. I was there for that, and for the simple patience of a bobber drifting through moonlight, a red bead under a small ribbon of cloud that kept changing shape while pretending it wasn't. The public pier on Birch Lake reaches 20 yards off a shallow shelf, just far enough to feel you've left the shore and joined the water. The state had put a dim sodium lamp halfway down that worked when it felt like it. Tonight, it gave a tired orange that left more shadows than it cured. I set my Coleman lantern low by the tackle box, turned the headlamp to its weakest setting, and let the dark have most of its way. The air sat cool and clean. I wore a sweater that smelled faintly of cedar from a closet that had swallowed winters. The thermos kept a coffee heat that fit the hour. I heard one car on the county road in the first 20 minutes, then only the light slosh of the lake touching itself along the pilings. My bobber drifted toward a ragged line where lily pads would claw back in a month. When the float twitched, it wasn't a fish yet, just the lake breathing different. On shore behind me, birch leaves moved in a hush that could have been wind or a small animal nosing for something sweet. I let the line creep and didn't raise the rod. Night fishing is half permission, half restraint. Somewhere down the shore, frogs went silent. Not all at once, the way a clap can chase around a room, but in neat segments, 1,000 little throats closing along a curve that travelled like a slow breeze. My eyes went to the distance without meaning to. The stillness rolled past the campground spit, under the posture of a pine with a broken crown, and then it reached the reeds near the canoe launch. When it arrived at the pier, the quiet felt like someone put a hand on my shoulder and asked me to listen harder. I told myself a muskrat had spooked the chorus, or a heron ghosting the shallows on stilt legs. The story was thin even as I said it in my head. But you try on a ready explanation first, the way you pull a jacket off a hook to see if the weather will accept it. The lantern sputtered. A soot burst from the mantle like it had swallowed a bug. The light shrank a notch and turned the boards around me into a darker geometry. My phone compass spun once on the pier railing when I checked the time. USB battery pack still healthy. Bars moving between 1 and none. The arrow refusing to decide which way north deserved. The bobber ticked sideways, then back. Then began a slow, purposeful drift that argued against the minor currents I'd learned across an hour. I gave the line what it asked and readied the hook set, shoulder loose, breath easy. The drift stopped. The float bumped the pier like it had reached a post that wasn't there. The rod tip trembled as if a weight had touched the line without agreeing to be a fish yet. And then the pier flexed. A small, careful give underfoot. A slow press and release, like something large had settled on the far end, and thought better of it. The nails in the nearest plank gave a polite tick as the wood accepted the idea and sprung back. Beaver, I thought. Big one. Odd hour. Odd place. The word held until I saw the bait bucket. I keep it upright under the bench, lid on. Rocks set inside so it won't dump if a boot nudges it. When I reached for another shiner, the handle lay tipped, and the lid had revolved in a way it does when you align the tabs and twist. Inside, the water was low, and the bait was gone. Not spilled, not sloshed over the lip, just gone, with 3 little scales sliding along the inner wall, like confetti after a small parade. Wind could do funny things to lids, but wind didn't lift the bucket without a splash. Wind didn't return it upright and leave the boards under it dry. Across the water, a travelling V marked the surface in the glow. A wake with no obvious author, keeping a parallel line to shore as if something walked the very edge underneath. Head just barely up, ears like small sails. The V held tidy for 20 yards, then faded where fog thickened and the moon gave up the effort. I stood and let the boards remember my weight, so they'd have fewer surprises left. The sound of frogs reappeared on the campground side in a cautious trickle, like someone testing a microphone. It failed to return near me. Silence can be a kind of voice when it chooses the right place. The pier's dim lamp flickered and died, and for a minute the only light was the small courage of my lantern and the way moon painted the water enough to write with. I thought about the way big fish sometimes show themselves with a back or tail. I thought about otters and how strange and generous they can look in night water. I thought about wolves, because northern country likes to make a person's shape for the old stories to wear. The boards at the far end yielded again. Not a jump, not a clatter. A patient acceptance of something placing weight where park carpenters had planned children and coolers. Not a chest, like a man's underfur that turns wet and dark at the ends. I didn't see it yet. The pier told me it was there. "Hey there," I said, because when you work around animals you learn the value of voice. Easy. From the reeds left of the canoe launch, a low chuff came. Not a bark, not a cough. A clearing of lungs with intent behind it, the way a big dog reads the air layered over water. It carried farther than it should have, as if the lake liked the sound and helped it along. I slid my hand to the lantern valve and turned it up a notch until the mantle steadied. The light showed the near half of the pier, the scuffed bench, the bucket with its ridiculous, honest rocks, and, 8 feet away, 2 wet impressions on the boards, side by side, each the size of my palm, each with the suggestion of pads and a pressed crescent, where a claw had kissed down without needing to cut wood. They glistened like fresh handprints from a swimmer climbing onto a dock and deciding whether to come up farther. The prints darkened as water left them for air. I crouched and watched the edges turn from shine to damp, to the colour of the boards. Between the 2 marks, a small line of lake water had run toward a gap between planks, a thin signature of something that had rested a moment, braced, then moved. I put my headlamp briefly to medium and cast the beam toward the end of the pier. The light hit the final posts and bounced, found fog, made a curtain. Against that pale curtain, a shape edited the world. Tall through the shoulders, head forward, ears upright like small knife blades. A long snout held down as if scent mattered more than sight. The arms, or forelimbs, rested on the railing posts with an ease that said it had used hands there, not paws, even if the hands ended in something that could mark wood when it chose. I lowered the beam. The shape remained in my understanding even when I couldn't see it. The frog chorus stayed gone along the tree line to my right. The travelling V showed again, closer to the canoe launch now, heading north with the shore like a companion moving in step. The pier flexed one more time, then gave me the gentle relief of releasing weight. A canoe thumped against the pilings, not hard. The kind of bump a tide boat makes when a passenger tests it with a hand. The bump came twice, then the water grew still. I listened for paddle drips and heard none. A park boat's engine murmured far across the lake, then rose as it turned into my bay. Patrol runs through in spring to keep campers honest and to find the night fishermen who forget licenses. The spotlight came low first, making a wide white. It climbed the trees like daylight learning to walk, then swept the water in a patient, slow arc. "Evening," a voice called from a distance, amused at itself, not at me. "Evening," I called back, steady. The light never came close to my face. It washed the end of the pier and turned fog into a shining wall for a heartbeat. In that white, there was no shape. There was only air and water and 2 pilings with fresh, high scars I hadn't noticed. Long fibers of wood lifted and unraveled at a height above my reach. Not the thin claw scratches of raccoons, not the imprecise chew of rodents. More like someone strong had tested the post and decided it should understand who owned weight out here. By the time the boat drifted parallel, the frogs tested their voices near me again. 1, then 3, then the whole choir pretending they'd never stopped. The ranger asked for my license with the gentle boredom of a man working a nice night. He saw the lantern and the bucket and the modest rod and nodded at the coffee like it was the most normal thing he'd witnessed in weeks. "Quiet night," he said. "Quiet," I said, and didn't tell him about the other kind of quiet, because he'd probably have to report it, and then someone would have to call someone else, and the pier would no longer be a place for sitting and listening to frogs decide what they wanted to do with the dark. He thanked me and moved on, the boat's wake lifting the pier in an honest wave that felt good after the careful flexes. The spotlight stroked the shoreline farther north and made trees into theatre. My lantern hummed as if pleased to be allowed back into the business of small light. When I packed to go sometime after 3, the pad prints had gone to faint outlines, darker ovals drying from the edges inward. A few scales from the missing shiners still clung to the inside wall of the bucket, silver in my headlamp before I wiped them out with a cloth. At the end of the pier, the high scars on the post showed fresh wood pale and willing, as if it had been asked a question and hadn't learned how to refuse. On the path back to the car, birch trunks stood like witnesses. The frog chorus held steady. My phone compass decided to find north again and pointed exactly where I would have chosen if I'd needed to make the case in the dark. I drove slow through the campground lane. In the mirror, the lake kept its glass. The pier lay level behind me, pretending it had always been only boards and nails, and the faint smell of cedar carried home on an old sweater. Out here, we measure winter in the way the plough blade talks to the road. Bare pavement sings under steel. Packed snow hums like a drumhead. Gravel complains in a low growl that makes you lift the blade a hair, or you'll buy the shop coffee for a week. I've run Route C17 for 6 seasons, through the flats where wind makes dunes over the blacktop, and the spruce stands that keep adrift like a secret until you nose into it, and the whole world tilts white. That night started simple. Snow had been steady since sundown, fine-grained and dry, the kind that chases along the beam and never looks like it's falling so much as arriving. I topped the salt at the municipal barn, checked the strobe trees, cleaned the mirrors with a towel that had more road than cloth left to it, and took the truck out with a thermos rattling in its ring. You learn the route's breathing. There's a turnout at mile 11, where the county keeps a covered salt bin and a spot big enough to swing the plough around. The wind sets a leeward drift against the fence, there every storm, and the deer step the fence where the snow piles deep enough to make equals of them and wire. I staged there at 2:58 a.m. to give the spreader a look. Snow had slicked under the auger shroud, and I wanted it clean. The roof ambers pulsed, painting the falling snow a kind of honey. The rear work light threw a rectangle onto the bin and the churned ground. I killed the blade, set the brake, and stepped down. The air had a taste like coin on the tongue, cold metal and salt crystals. I kept the cab door cracked because out here you let heat breathe rather than lose it all at once. There were drag marks under the bin where something had worked a 50-pound bag loose. The bag had been in the middle row when I saw it last, tucked in among its brothers with the twine facing out like the shop likes it. Now it lay on the ploughed track, unbroken but scuffed, a snail trail of crystals leading to it. What got me wasn't that it moved. Wind knocks things around, but the path it took. A straight pull from pallet to ground with no boot prints, no deer slots, no mouse scribbles. The snow around it showed nothing but the wide, smooth skim of drift. Wind, I said aloud. Gale in here tonight. The bin's opening makes its own weather when the breeze hits right. I've seen eddies that could pick a hat up and put it 10 yards off. But wind wouldn't turn a bag and lay it neat with the twine-cinched side facing me, like a good dog bringing a glove. I crouched to lift it back. The twine showed 4 deep dents at intervals too wide for a small dog, too narrow for a bear's molars, as if teeth had tested the knot and let go. When I hefted the bag, it felt 60 rather than 50. Wet maybe. I set it down again and tore the corner to drain clump salt that would otherwise seize. The rip showed a neat pair of punctures near the tear, not slashes, not the messy chew of raccoons. 2 clean holes, spaced like they'd been measured. The VHF radio chattered, then spit static, then settled. C-17, copy? The dispatcher sounded far, even though the tower sits on Stag Hill. I keyed the mic. It hissed instead of answering. The AVL screen on the dash froze with my truck icon a mile north of where I stood, then stayed like a photo. "All right," I said, like the night and I were old friends. "We'll call this maintenance and keep rolling." When I climbed back up, the truck's temp display still insisted it was 28 degrees, even though the inside of my nose said 20. I dropped the blade and pushed west. At mile 12, the blade hit a packed something that made the whole chassis shrug. Not like solid ice, not like a manhole. More like you catch the top of a frozen drift with a web inside it. I lifted a hair, and the resistance vanished. In the reflection off the bank, I saw a low collapse 6 feet into the drift, like something had held a crawl space and then decided the weight of the plow's rumble wasn't worth the roof. Snow fell into it with a soft sigh and erased its own map. Breath plumes crossed the headlight beam in a slow, parallel line along the ditch, 2, then a third farther back, moving left to right as if a thing kept pace with me from the dark just beyond the snow glow. You see deer steam like that some nights, but their plumes come taller and then are gone because deer don't stay where trucks are. These hung low, deliberate, strung like beads on the edge of my light. I ran the route another mile and circled back for a cleanup pass. The rear spreader whined and started throwing salt and sand in a clean fan. The sound is a comfort. You know you're making the road better than you found it. I caught a different sound under it. Wet licking. Not the slap of chains or the patter of spatter. Licking. Slow, then faster. As if something big had learned that the crystals tasted like something it wanted and had gotten braver about taking them. I cut the spreader and let the rear work lights show me the plume of crystals dropping off the spinner. Snow drifted sideways through it, catching grains like stars. Beyond the light, the ditch held a shape that didn't separate neatly from spruce shadow. I couldn't make it honest in my head, so I didn't try to name it. I bumped the throttle and let the big diesel throat up a little. The licking stopped. A low thud touched the bald steel step under my door, like a hand or forelimb testing the rung without committing to climb. "Hey," I said, more to keep my voice a part of the world than to talk to anything that would answer. The windshield wipers made their quarter-pointed pass. Snow refilled the clear seconds they gave me. I idled forward. Whatever was keeping me company chose the edge of my light like it was a fence. The truck's halo didn't touch it. It didn't touch me. We went in parallel for a while, west, toward the farm road that nobody plows until morning, past the place where Old Man Dyer lets his cows out when he shouldn't. On the third pass east, wind had made a clean scimitar of drift across both lanes. I put the blade down and split it, snow rolling away in a white ribbon. Halfway through the cut, the blade picked something again, this time a resistance that moved with me for 10 feet, then slipped out like a fish leaving a net. When I stopped and backed up, a tuft dark as spilled oil clung to the cutting edge where the night had left me something to think about. I took it with a gloved finger and set it on the dash. It wasn't cow hair, wasn't deer. Hollow guard hair, long and coarse. The kind you see on animals that sleep outside when winter means it. The radio found itself long enough to cough a half message. C-17, if you're by mile 11. State has a trooper running 95 north. Last reported. Then static again. Like the same wind that wrote drifts had his hand over the mic. I nosed back into the turnout to top the spreader. The bag I'd torn earlier lay where I hadn't left it. Adrift at the edges now. Crystals melted into its side like sweat. I swung down with the rear work light making its white square on the scene. The drag marks from before had widened, crossing over themselves. A small geometry of pull and rest. No prints. The snow there was a skin of hardpack with new powder on top, as good as flour for recording truth. And it told me nothing except that something clever enough to stay on the firm layer had been there. On the far side of the turnout, the wind had cut a crawl into the bank, an oval mouth tall as my chest, where the drift's lip hung like a wave frozen mid-curl. The inside showed smoothing, not collapse, as if something long had slid through and polished the walls with its shoulders. Not a culvert, not a foxhole. Bigger, recently used. Snow on the lip shedding crumbs when the wind probed it, then settled. I didn't go look. I've learned which curiosities are still there after sunup. I climbed back in and for once let the spreader hit full. Salt rattled and sang. The crystals bounced and skittered and made a small universe behind me, and I revved the engine higher than I needed to. Not rudely, just enough to say that the truck meant to be loud now. The breath plumes along the ditch line broke and faded. Something heavy moved inside the drift a dozen yards away and chose a different place to be. From 4:20 on, the storm changed character. Snow thickened, wind dropped. The world went to a quieter room where sounds carry farther because nothing jostles them. I made one more loop for cleanliness, knocked snow off the ploughshoes in the turnout, and let my shoulders decide they weren't braced anymore. As dawn found its way into the sky, the radio came true and said ordinary things. I told dispatch I had a bad AVL and a line of drift still forming near the flats. The trooper never called in for my stretch. Maybe he'd gone another way. When I did get out for good, the bag showed fresh work. 2 new punctures twinned to the first, larger spacing than any farm dog I know, set just off the original. A tongue had worked the tear wider. Crystals melted inside into a brine that would have tasted like the sea to anything that had learned to crave it. I took a photo, because you take photos now, even if you never show them to anyone who didn't have to be there. Near the bank's crawl mouth, the wind had made a fine skim over prints that had to have been cleared 20 minutes earlier. You could still read the length, longer than Wolf by a measure that didn't sit easy, and the set. 2 by 2 with the outside toes kissing clean at the front, claws inscribing deliberate commas, the kind a heavy animal leaves when it doesn't hurry. Between 2 strides, halfway to the spruce, a place where something had paused and pressed forward onto forelimbs, deepening the marks there, while the hind imprints went shallow as if hips had risen. Not a bound, a change in mind. I brushed the guard hair on my dash with the back of a knuckle. It held a frost that didn't melt right away. In the mirror, the drift's crawl mouth looked like a doorway that nobody had asked me to open. I cleared C17 by 512, tired the way plough drivers get when the edges of things have been too close for a little too long. On the ride back, the plough sang bare pavement in 2 glorious miles the wind hadn't touched. I let the heater bias to the windshield and watched the snow line pull away in the glass. People say we imagine things on this shift. That night makes stories where daylight makes lists. I like lists. The list from that route reads: bag moved without prints, punctures too neat, blade found and then not, breath plumes, step on the cab rung, hair on the steel, a crawl through drift that wasn't there at 2 and was polished at 4. The rest is quiet, and I let quiet be the last word whenever I can. The shop lights had a yellow honesty when I backed into the bay. I set the hair in an envelope I didn't label and wiped the cutting edge with a rag that took more than it could give back. By the time I finished the thermos, the storm had tired to flurries and the sun put a little milk into the sky, the color the world uses when it would rather you sleep. I signed the sheet. Nobody asked me if I'd seen anything. I said I'd go back out at 8 if the wind climbed. And I will. The road is the road, and my job is to make it true. Graveyard out here is a conversation between machines that don't care if you answer. The ice machine hums and forgets itself. The drink cooler ticks like a distant metronome. The canopy lights buzz with the kind of tired electricity that makes moths believe in bad ideas. I keep the floor mopped, the coffee hot enough to forgive the brand, and the receipt paper loaded so I don't have to argue with the one guy who always needs a signature after midnight. The station sits off 491, lonesome as a promise. 2 pump islands under a sodium canopy, a cinder block store with a cooler wall that fogs when the door's been busy, and a back lot where a rail spur dies into weeds and the arroyo slumps like a breath let out too far. Trailer lights roll past sometimes and never stop. I wave anyway, habit built into the bones of boredom. Just after 12, wind pushed a thin skin of dust along the asphalt. It made small devils in the edges of light, and then gave up when they crossed the dark. I propped the door with the rubber wedge, let the cool, dry air push the fryer smell out, and counted scratch-off rolls for the log. The bell over the door gave a polite single ding, even though nobody touched it. The wedge still held the door wide. I glanced up at the glass. Empty pumps. The road a straight black ribbon to tomorrow. Old switch, I told myself. Bell hears things. I set it in the book, because setting things in a book keeps the world square. The CCTV monitors jittered. Grain snowed across the night vision view, and then the infrared bloomed the back lot into an overexposed sheet before it all settled into fuzz. I tapped the side of the DVR with a knuckle because my granddad swore that fixes most machines and some people. It didn't. At 12:41, gravel pattered on the roof. 2 soft showers, like someone kicked a few pebbles along the edge up there and then changed their mind. The wind doesn't throw stones. Wind throws dust and the occasional unlucky receipt. I went outside under the canopy and let the sodium light draw the world in simple lines. The roofline sat clean against the stars. The wind flag at the diesel pump showed a steady lean and no gust. I told myself the stones had been up there already and were negotiating their future. That was when I saw the jackrabbit. It lay by pump 2, whole and wrong. Not torn, not road flattened, not chewed. Laid. The ears were folded back, not broken. The eyes half-lidded the way prey goes when the world has had enough of its running. There wasn't blood. There wasn't even dirt. Rabbits don't go to ground under sodium light to nap. Something had put it there, with the tidy tuckedness of a thing that doesn't have to explain itself. I looked out past the canopy into the dark where the arroyo cut a grey line. The wind carried dry sage and old oil. I felt the turn in the air that sometimes precedes a train miles off. The rail spur doesn't see traffic anymore, but still remembers. Inside, the POS terminal decided it wanted to taste a chip card, even though nobody had one in its mouth. It chirped. It asked for a PIN. It sighed into a reboot loop that put my register total into limbo for 2 minutes. The landline rang once, and then lost its memory of how to be a phone. I wrote those down too, because the book doesn't judge patterns until you decide to. At 1:08, the dumpster lid lifted and came down with more care than gravity would give it. The sound came through the block wall like a hand on a drum. Thump. Pause. Soft drop. I stepped into the back room and stood by the employee door, the one with the push bar and the alarm will sound sticker. That lies. The bar flexed a hair in the frame. Not enough to move the latch. just enough to ask the building who was in charge. It set itself back, like a polite person declining a dance. I didn't open that door. I went to the front and washed a perfectly clean coffee pot, because running water is the friend of people who need to think without appearing to. Something scraped along the concrete by the ice chest outside. The sound of plastic dragged, a stop, a small adjustment. I stepped forward where I could see through the windows, but kept the fluorescence at my back so the glass held my reflection, and the outside had to work to show me itself. The big, white cooler that sells bags on Sundays had shifted 3 inches from its chalky rectangle. A bead of static dust outlined its old footprint. The new place showed fresh concrete like a scar. Across the styrofoam lid, someone had drawn 3 slow rakes, widely spaced, deep enough to lift clean curls that caught the light and trembled in the breeze. I told myself teenagers. I told myself prank. I told myself a man with too much boredom and a set of drywall claws wanted to make a mark. The story didn't hold their weight. A tall shadow stood beyond the fuel island, just outside the canopy's clean, and just inside the night's patience. You can measure a thing you can't see by what it edits. This one cut the line of the pump's price sign at a height that put its shoulders even with the green numbers. The head sat forward from the line of the body, snout long, ears like the points on a cutting torch flame. It didn't move the way men move. It held. It watched. I didn't turn the brighter lights on. I didn't lift a hand. I stood with the counter under my fingers because the counter has done me favors before. The doorbell decided to chime again without a door moving. Behind me, the cooler case LED flickered, found itself, and held steady. On the glass of the storefront, 8 feet up where no shoulder should graze, a smudge appeared. The kind are palm leaves when print powder hasn't been kind. Oil and dust kissing into 2 broad pads with suggestions of longer fingers above. Not a raccoon splay, not a man smooth. The smudge slid in a patient arc, as if someone had leaned to see if I'd make the mistake of stepping toward the door. I didn't. I waited for the wind to show me a lie, and it did not. Minutes do strange math when your attention refuses to blink. The jackrabbit by pump 2 remained where it had been placed, neat as a folded towel. The ice chest ticked as if it were cooling itself down from a thought. Out by the arroyo, dust rolled in a low line and then settled as if the ground had exhaled. The CCTV perked and gave me 30 honest seconds of the backlot. In that window, the security LED made a white pool beyond the dumpsters, and the edge of the concrete showed prints that the wind hadn't owned yet, 2 by 2. Long stride to the rail spur, claws inscribing commas like a person learning a foreign alphabet. The image snowed again before I could think to hit record on my phone. I didn't need the video to remember what I'd seen. When the time stretched thin enough to hum, I turned the coffee pot warmer down and stepped back to where the push bar waited. I didn't touch it. I just stood there so the building could remember that someone inside belonged to it. The bar settled another millimeter and quit its ideas. At 2:54, the roof gravel pattered again, closer to the front this time, above the canopy edge where pigeons never roost, because the hawks own the daylight. 2 little showers, polite, then quiet in a way that seemed chosen rather than given. Headlights far down the highway rose to a long growl. 2 Harleys, big touring rigs, came in from the north with the kind of voice engines make when the riders wear their miles like a shared story. They turned in, exhaust bouncing off the block and making everything human. The tall shadow stepped backward into the night in a way my eyes didn't catch as movement, but my chest felt as release. The rabbit by Pump 2 lay alone in the honest light. The bikers did the routine. Kickstands, stretch, voice a complaint about wind chill through a grin. "Open," one called, as if the fluorescent glare and bell hadn't answered. "All night," I said. It came out level. They wanted coffee and a map no one needs with phones. They wanted to talk about the time they outran a monsoon in Quartzsite and how the sky can split clean over the desert, as if someone drew a knife through a pane of glass and let the wet side fall. I liked them for having that memory. When the door shut behind them on their way out, the bell dinged the way bells are supposed to. One of them stopped, looked at the glass high up, and said, "What the hell's that?" Not afraid, just curious, the way road people are about marks. "Wind," I said, and let it be true enough for the hour. We stood a minute while they sipped and looked. The jackrabbit wasn't by the pump anymore. It wasn't anywhere. No blood, no hair, no drift of fluff toggled by a breeze. Just a clear smear on the dust where something had lifted it as carefully as it had set it down. "You get coyotes?" the other asked. "Sometimes," I said. They left in a roll of noise that pushed the night back to the arroyo. The canopy lights buzzed the way they always buzzed. The POS found its manners. The CCTV stayed unhelpful because machines are brave when the show is over. Just before 4, I walked the island with the long squeegee and the blue paper towels that shine like hope under sodium. On the canopy column nearest Pump 2, the dust held 3 long guard hairs where the wind had pasted them. Hollow-centered when held to light, dark at the cuticle. The kind winter coats wear in places that still earn their weather. On the ice chest lid, the 3 rakes showed fresh white beads where the plastic had surrendered and hadn't learned to dry yet. I didn't take the hairs inside. I left them where the morning man could find them if the morning man was the kind who noticed anything but the safe count. I mopped and set the wedge and let the door breathe the rest of the night out into the desert. The book reads, "Bell without door twice, roof gravel patter twice, rabbit placed then removed, glass smudge high, ice chest moved, back door bar flexed, camera bloom, POS loop, landline 1 ring dead." That's enough. I don't add adjectives. I don't put a name to the shadow. The road will still be out there when my shift bites the sun and the trucks turn from ghost to freight again. The desert doesn't promise anything except space. Sometimes something tall stands in part of it and reminds you that not all choices are yours. At 4:27, I turned the open sign off so it could rest before the day shamed it back on. The wind eased. The glass held the faintest echo of a handprint 8 feet up until the sun would take it. I locked the safe and counted the drawer and listened to the ice machine believe in itself. Whatever had kept me company went wherever things like that preferred to keep their hours. The counter under my palms felt like the world I could carry. The rest belonged to the dark and the dust and the way engines sound when they mean it. The yard pole light on the farm doesn't so much shine as remember how. It fades to a sodium pink when it gets tired, and then sighs back into a blue-white that makes the sheet metal on the grain bins look like spilled moon. I had the place to myself that week, owner down at his mother's and me minding the equipment before the last push. The machine shed doors were slid shut except for one bay, where the 9660 sat idling at a lazy lope to charge its batteries. The tractor's work lights threw honest rectangles across the gravel and left everything just beyond to decide its own shape. Routine fixes most nights. Check the bin fans, make sure raccoons hadn't turned the dog food into a buffet, keep the calves honest in their pen, logged the hours on the combine. I walked the perimeter with the headlamp on low, letting the yard light do the heavy lifting. Wind came down the shelter belt from the north in a steady ribbon that moved the cottonwoods and left the corn mostly still. The first odd thing was the ladder on the east bin. It rattled. Not a full clatter, just the sound the cage makes when someone touches it and lets go. The wind wasn't enough to do it. That ladder takes a storm to sing. I held the beam on the rungs long enough to feel foolish, then moved on with the mental note that farm steel has a memory too. At the manway on the cone, the hand wheels sat a half turn off what I remembered. I chalked those wheels after I tightened them, because I don't like guessing. My chalk mark had moved. White line not quite meeting white line. Not open, not loose. Just adjusted, then politely set back. The yard pole light cycled at 12:07, dipping to pink. The machine shed T5s, hummed and stayed solid. In the dip, something long crossed the seam between two bins. A shadow that wasn't a man or a dog. The legs didn't walk the way either do. The head sat forward of the shoulders, in a way that suggested a long neck that wasn't really a neck at all, and ears that made small knife points when they cut across the shine. I let my hands stay at my sides, and I didn't give the headlamp more power. The beam you choose is the size of the truth you permit. I wanted a small truth for now. The calves lowed in unison from the east pen, a chorus that sounded more like a question than a complaint, then went quiet, as if someone had shushed them. I set my boots on the packed lane that runs between the bins and the machine shed. Gravel underfoot is an honest friend. The trail camera on the corner post popped its IRS twice, clicked as if thinking, and when I checked the screen it showed 2 blank frames, white bloom, then black. Every odd minute after that, my FM radio on the bench in the shed tugged to static for a heartbeat and returned, like it had remembered a station I couldn't have tuned if I wanted to. Past midnight, the corn did a thing corn shouldn't. The wind was from the north. The rows to the south of the bins leaned north for a long sigh. Then some part of them flexed back the wrong way, a ripple running against the breeze like something moved under the tassels, not with the air but with intent. It ran 3 rows in from the headland, then curved and paused. Stalks stilled as if something tall had crouched. I walked to the field edge with the beam at my boots, so the world didn't take offense. The Scarecrow, at the corner, wore a seed corn cap and a faded flannel. We'd set him 2 weeks back to make the deer feel unwelcome. He had been facing the county road. Now he faced the bins. Someone had lifted him and turned him neat, heel of one boot scuffing a crescent into the headland dust. His cap brim pointed at the manway I chalked. Kids, I told myself, and listened to my voice tried the word on. The night wasn't impressed. Back in the yard, the silage auger coughed without its motor. Dust rose from the cone in a soft breath, as if the guts of the bin had exhaled. A smear of powder slid down the steel, and when I put my glove to it, it bore the shine of a hand pressed and drawn, fingers indistinct, palm broad, lines that suggested claws not yet put to work. I wiped the dust off my glove and wished I hadn't. Near the machine shed, a feed scoop stood upright on its lip at a physics off angle, balanced where it shouldn't have been able to, as if someone with patient hands had set it there and waited to see how long it would remain. I watched it a half minute, expecting the world to correct the mistake. It didn't. I set it flat, and the small sound it made against concrete felt louder than a dropped pipe. The yard pole came back to blue-white, and then chose steady for a stretch. between the bins, the long shadow appeared again, closer now, pausing the way you stop between breaths to read a smell. I saw the suggestion of fur laid tight to a narrow waist, and the taller breadth above it that wasn't human bulk, more like a running animal, pausing halfway to a different idea of standing. A forelimb touched the bin cone, pushed, and the hand wheel made that small, hateful half-turn back, and then forward again, so my chalks met their mates. The courtesy of it made me colder than rudeness would have. I didn't move fast. I backed along the shed wall to the farmhouse lane. The motion floods on the porch can be as touchy as a neighbor. They decided tonight to be helpful. They blinked on with a soft pop and held. The yard changed shape under their long throw. The cattle pressed the fence as a group, 20 heads tilting in the same direction, ears forward, eyes wide enough to rim white, breath making small fog in the cool. Then they leaned as if the herd had agreed to move the whole world a foot south. The top rail groaned. Staples on one post squealed and gave a quarter inch, bent in a little V where the fence had asked the steel to negotiate. From the corn, the wrong way ripple ran again, closer to the headland, paused at the Scarecrow, and did not touch it this time. I saw the cap brim twitch as if a breath had caught it and let it go. I talked out loud to the calves the way you do to animals that need you to choose the temperature of a moment. Easy, I said. We're all fine. I didn't know if we were, but the words have work to do independent of the facts. The long shadow between the bins shifted. For the first time, I saw height I could measure. A head level with the upper lip of the manway, ears upright, a long muzzle angled down, arms, yes, arms, ending in hands that balanced against steel like a gymnast testing a bar for flex. The fingers were longer than a dog's reach could claim, but thicker than a man's unless he had spent his life turning soil and iron. A claw tapped the rim once. Not a scratch, a test. Then it lifted, and the ladder cage answered with the lightest rattle as something brushed it on a turn. I let the porch floods keep doing their job. I didn't advance and I didn't retreat. The cattle pushed again as a warning. Fence posts chimed in their sleeves. The yard pole didn't cycle. That felt like luck. The thing crossed the seam toward the dark between the bins where the floods didn't reach. I brought the headlamp up just enough to catch the sheen of chaff swirling where feet had disturbed it. 2 prints set deep in the loose mess, 2 by 2. Front pair planted a hair wider than the back. Outer toes cutting comma-shaped cavities, dew-claw kisses on one print like half-moons. I could have lain my hand in one pad impression and had room at the edges. I didn't follow. I stood with the porch light throwing my shadow thin across the lane like a string. The wrong way ripple in the corn withdrew toward the fence row and softened into normal wind. The Scarecrow kept its eyes on the bins because something had told it to keep looking. At 3:18, the radio static trick did its minute mark thing, and then forgot it. The trail cam gave me one clear still. The line between the bins with dust in the air, a vertical shape cut into it, the top of the ladder cage behind, a faint gleam of eye you could mistake for a reflection if you wanted to keep your life uncomplicated. The next frame was black, as if the night had put a palm over the lens. I made rounds until 4, slow enough not to bruise the dark. The yard held. The porch floods, once on, refused to time out, as if the farm had decided to be its own company until dawn. The cattle eased off the rail a half inch at a time and went back to that soft, contented chewing that means we chose to live here again. I walked to the headland and turned the Scarecrow back toward the county road, with a breath I felt in my elbows. When the owner called at first light to ask after the batteries on the combine, I told him they were strong and the bins were tight. Both true. I did not tell him about the chalk marks, or the handslide in the dust, or the way corn can move contrary in a place that knows the wind better than I do. Before I went in to let the coffee pretend it was rest, I looked once more at the manway. My chalk met my chalk. The hand wheel felt like a thing that had been considered and spared. On the cone, the dust I hadn't wiped told its story easy in new daylight, lines where fingers had spread weight without scratching, the kind muscle memory keeps. In the chaff at my feet, the two prints had softened from edges to ovals, as if the night had wanted them less sharp now that it was done speaking. I left the scoop on its side where it belongs. A small victory, but mine. The porch floods clicked off on their own with the sun's first try. The yard pole went to blue-white without cycling. The calves sighed. The corn stood ordinary like it had always meant to. The farm gave me back the list of things I could fix with wrenches and grease, and I took it, grateful. The last westbound cleared at 23:48. I watched its rear marker fade into rain glow and counted the ties down to quiet the way old heads do. After that, the line belonged to maintenance until 4. I parked the high-rail truck a mile east, where the ballast shoulders out, and walked in with the headlamp on medium, so the fog would give me something back instead of throwing every drop into a white wall. The trestle took the river at a pinch point, steel bents and riveted gussets with a service catwalk bolted to the downstream side. Somebody had replaced 3 web plates the week before. My job was to check bolts after the first heavy traffic and sign the sheet so the next crew could say the right names when asked. Creosote lived in the wood like an old story. On still nights you hardly catch it. Tonight, the smell rose in slow waves without wind, thick enough to taste. I told myself damp timber breathed like a person. The explanation wore thin as soon as I thought it. Ballast tells the truth if you look low. On the east approach, the granite had a line down its center, where boots repeat the habit of a man who works alone. My prints joined that. Off the shoulder, someone had set pebbles in pairs like long strides walking parallel to the ties. 2, then 2, then 2 again. Gaps too wide for a man with a normal gait, unless he was vaulting between sleepers for no reason. No tail drags, no scuffs like hooves. The pairs went right to the abutment and vanished into dark that kept its mouth shut. "Dear," I said out of habit, and let the headlamp see me shake my head at my own voice. Deer don't set stones in pairs. People don't either, unless they're proving something strange. Down on the catwalk, the metal grating thudded a little under my weight, and took to it like a bridge does, first skeptical, then accepting. I clamped the magnetic worklight at a gusset and jawed a wrench onto the first nut. The river moved dark under me in slow seams, fish ladder weirs shushing like distant conversation. A set of low nav lights along the ladder made a dim chain that trembled in the fog. My radio carried a voice without words, carry a hum, then nothing. Dispatch probably stepping on someone down valley. I keyed up anyway. Bridge 37, west approach inspection, clear. No answer, just the hum, like a throat clearing in another room. The second gusset gave me a bolt that didn't want to feel tight yet. I backed it a half turn and chased its threads with a shot of oil. The catwalk vibrated then, and my hands told me it wasn't from what I was doing. Not the high, quick shiver when a train's out over the truss. This was slower, like weight testing the far end. A note that travelled the flange and made the ladder cage at the pier hum a small sympathetic song. No train on the sheet, I said. The river didn't argue. The track circuit monitor on my phone blinked occupied for a breath. Then clear, the way it does when fog finds a cable splice and makes mischief. I stared at it a second longer than was useful and put the phone away. When I moved to the next bay, the headlamp spent too long hunting focus on a web plate 9 feet up, like the fog between my eyes and the steel had turned to gel. I aimed the beam off so it wouldn't fight me and saw, in the crosslight from the work lamp, a wet shape on the plate, a palm print wide as a saucer with finger trails longer than my hand, grease smeared into the rivet heads where a thing had pressed and then slid for balance. It was fresh enough that little dark beads gathered at the lower edges and fell in very slow tears. I took 2 photos, swiping to make the phone choose its mind about the blur. It obliged by giving me 1 true frame and then going soft again, like I'd moved a hair. I hadn't. Something scraped a girder flange to my right, steady, not quick, like a long nail reading the seam between pieces as if seams had a language. The catwalk answered with a tiny flex. I set my wrench down so the noise of it wouldn't mean more than I wanted. At the downstream abutment, the fog lay heavy against the river skin. Concentric rings rose there, made by nothing I could see. A perfect circle blossoming in the dark. Then another a few yards toward mid-channel, marching away like someone tapped the water gently at measured spacings, with the end of a pole. Fish do that sometimes at dawn. It wasn't dawn. Each ring set gave me the thought of someone walking where the surface shouldn't hold a stride. I kept to the catwalk's inside handrail and moved under the first span. The ladder cage to the upper cord had 1 rung bent out of round, ovaled like a big hand had grabbed it and squeezed. Steel does that when it meets motive force. The paint on the oval showed fingernail arcs in dust. A curl lifted and resting on the cage brace like it couldn't decide whether to fall. Test it, don't break it, I said, without knowing who the advice belonged to. Something chuffed low in the concrete pocket where the trestle leg met its footing. Sound does tricks in girders. It throws a voice along angles and gives it a chest. This one had a canine throat in it. A quiet sound carried impatience rather than hurry. It didn't repeat. The river splayed concentric rings again, and the fog took them in. I put the work lamp on the ladder cage and let its small circle of clean white be a kind of holding pattern. Bridge inspectors collect tools and lights for the same reason children collect blankets, because maps in the dark need edges. Across on the upstream side, ballast shifted under the outer span with the slow tick a shoe makes when it finds a stone worth moving. Twice, then a third time, nearer the tie plates, as if weight matched my pacing from a lane I didn't shine. The high rail truck sat a mile east, little more than a shape in mind, but a thing on the far bank tapped its attention to the tires. 1 soft touch that set sidewall to talking, then nothing. I didn't look for eyes. I kept to steel I could name and bolts with numbers on them. The work light hummed. Fog rubbed the rail and tried to make it a whisper. I gave the work notes I would want to read later. Gusset B2 slight play corrected. Web plate shows non-mechanical smear photographed. Ladder cage rung deformed. Replace before next quarterly. Ballast disturbance outer span documented. The act of writing settled some part of me, the way a good tie plate settles a spike. At 3:12, the catwalk vibrated again. Not under my feet this time, but out at the mid-panel, where cross-bracing knots itself into geometry. I let the light fall there and saw a shadow cut from fog that wasn't iron and wasn't a human shape. Shoulders too tall, waist too narrow, head carried low like a runner's with a long muzzle that gathered fog at its tip and shook it off. A hand, call it a hand, touched the brace where 5 men have banged knuckles for 50 years, and left a patina of skin. Claws rested on paint without scoring. The thing shifted weight, and the rung at my side gave a little metal complaint, as if it remembered being squeezed. We stood a long minute like that. Me, at the near end of a catwalk with a pencil in my hand. It at the far end with the river making rings to mark its coordinates. I didn't bargain. I didn't bluff. I let the work lamp draw its modest circle around me and listened to the way fog changes the pitch of everything, even your breath. It moved first. A quick uncoil, forelimbs down the brace like a climber who knows what steel is for. A turn that put its back to me without offering me dignity. And a drop I didn't see, but felt in the catwalk under my boots. Ballast ticked twice, 3 times, then not at all. The river made its rings a last time and forgot the trick. The track circuit monitor blinked, occupied, and then clear again. I didn't report the blip because some days you have to choose which truths you can say with your name attached. I gathered photos. A close shot of the grease palm with a tape for scale. 2 of the ballast pairs with my boot, propped uselessly in frame. One of the ovaled rung with paint curls like fingernail pairings. The fog let each picture be a little too soft, as if it wanted me to leave a degree of doubt with future me, so I wouldn't have to argue about it over coffee. At 3:48, the fog thinned where the river widens below the bend. Dawn's first uncommitted light put a wash into the mist, the color of a breath someone else had warmed for you. The creosote smell fell back into the timbers, as if the wood had chosen privacy again. The work lamp made less of a difference, because the world had decided to help. I crossed the last panel and climbed to the approach. The paired pebbles on the ballast had taken a few more sets while I was on steel. Spaced like a metronome had been laid along the shoulder, each 2 stones pressed flat in the same direction, toes pointing west. I took that picture too and felt a little embarrassed by how gently I put the phone away afterward. On the way back to the truck, I kept the beam low and let the timber smell change to wet fern and rock. A tuft of hair had caught in the catwalk grate where the paint curls had fallen. A long, coarse guard hair with a hollow center where you can just see if you get it in the light right. I didn't pocket it. I don't keep souvenirs from things I don't intend to claim. At the milepost, I could see the high rail's amber strobes ticking to themselves because I'd left them in their slow memory mode. The sidewalls looked like sidewalls again. I set my clipboard on the seat and wrote the lines a supervisor expects to read, and beneath them the ones I would want to reread in 5 years when I doubted my own recollection. Grease palm on webplate approximately. 9 AGL. Ladder rung deformed by squeeze. Ballast paired set pattern paralleling ties. River surface rings in lanes. Creosote reek present were wind. Sunrise didn't arrive so much as agree. The fog took on enough color to call it morning. Whatever else had kept its hours near me preferred dark to help with its choices. It chose elsewhere. I rolled the truck down to the bridge and set the wheels on iron and drove the span once at walking pace, strobes working, work light off. The steel felt like itself again. No sympathetic music, no extra breath in the braces. That's all you ask a bridge before breakfast. If I get the quarterly, I'll bring a new rung and a can of the right paint, and I'll write the number on the form. I might even forget to remember the rings on the river, but I'll carry a second work lamp and set it where I can see my hands without asking the fog's permission, and I'll keep the beam on medium. The right size truth keeps the night kinder, even when it doesn't get smaller. Nights on a wind watch teach you how many voices a tower owns. The shutters tick when the air tilts against them. The floor planks give a soft breath when gusts lift and set the cab like a slow heartbeat. Even the Alidad lamp hums a little, barely there, so the glass can hold its circle of geography without feeling alone. My job was as simple as any. Log gusts, check for night smokes, and leave the radio on just high enough to hear the valley talk without giving the mountains a reason to echo it back at me. Mount Kestrel isn't the highest knob in the district, but it sits at a crossroads where outflows meet. On dry nights, wind combs the ridges from 2 directions and decides which way the canyons will sleep. The anemometer had been honest all afternoon, flirting with the high 20s at the peak of each set, then settling. By 11, the air had cooled into that clean pine and dust mixture that makes you think of pitch on hands and old canvas. I kept the red headlamp low to save night eyes and let the stars do their work. The ranch down valley kept a single yard light burning like a promise to itself. On the catwalk, the world went to edges and perfume. Sun-baked wood giving back what it had borrowed, lichen stone, a strand of sage stuck in a nail seam. Above the cab's lee side, a shutter hasp clicked once and rested. The sound, a small coin dropped into a jar. The handheld radio squelched, lifted a half call sign. 3 Bravo, and fell to carry a hum. I said Kestrel copies out of habit and logged the minute. The barometer drew a tiny frown on the chart, then forgot it. At 11:41, a guy wire twanged without a gust. Not a random shiver. A clean note, taut from anchor to tower, as if a finger had plucked it to test the tuning. On the windward side, the wire held its line. On the leeward, the note travelled down into the ground where the lightning rod braided into a ring around the helipad, and the cinders looked like spilled pepper. I made the first round, binoculars on the black, a slow sweep over saddles that liked to hide smoke. The bitterroots held their sawtooth shapes against a sky that kept its own counsel. On the north saddle, a shred of cloud scudded and cleared. No glow, no bloom. Back inside, I set the Alidad lamp lower and logged gusts at 24, 26, 19, a lazy 14 that made me look up as if the tower had exhaled. Something crossed the windward catwalk, the shape of it more suggestion than body. Mass editing starlight from one side of the door to the other in a long, quiet pass. The screen, old bronze mesh nailed into a frame that hated to open smoothly, pushed inward without feet on the steps. The latch held. The frame bounced and settled, as if a chest had leaned on it long enough to test the wood and found it worth knowing. "Not tonight," I said softly, "the way you talk to Bear who's used to good manners and bad ideas." The floor under the map table carried a brush of weight that did not belong to my boots. It ran under the planks from windward to leeward in a single line and stopped, a long body easing from shadow to shadow the way pine breathes around a rock. I set the lantern to its smallest circle and let the red headlamp carry me, so my hands would know their work. The Alidad sight drifted a hair off true, then returned on its own as the floor settled. I put my palm to the sight ring and told myself wood remembers summer, that's all. On the ladder, halfway down, a rung took a test weight, not a climb, a thoughtful press with enough patience to let the timber answer. The wind fell for 3 heartbeats, and the wire sang once more. A lower note, the ground ring buzzing like a plucked string under the cinders. I stepped to the hatch and looked through the slit of darkness that shows the ladder run. Starlight outlined a stretch of rail, and the suggestion of something tall shifting its balance in a space you could mistake for emptiness if you wanted to keep your night uncomplicated. The radio lifted again. Estrel, then a squeal. then quiet. I said nothing to it. I didn't want the tower to learn the sound of my nervous voice. At 12:23, the shutters on the leeward side made a polite clack, then eased back a half inch. Hasps don't move on their own. The wind streamed windward to leeward all night. No eddy should have reached there with enough hand to nudge. I stepped onto the catwalk and kept my body in the frame as if the tower could wear me like extra weight. The ridge below me held a longer shadow than it should, the kind that starts narrow and opens at the shoulders, the head forward of the line like a runner drawing scent, ears up. In the absence of beam, edges come from what the stars decide to remove. It stood there for a span of breath, and then the black took it, not by movement so much as by agreement. I went down one flight because standing still had let my thoughts get ahead of my boots. The ladder rails were cool and a little damp. Halfway, the rung with the test weight groaned time back at me and quit. Nothing touched me. The tower's timbers gave a soft, agreeable talk like boat planks in a small tide. At the ground ring, the cinders traced a wide arc. Fresh rake marks that weren't there 2 hours earlier, sweeping around the helipad in a patient semicircle. 2 by 2 gaps between each new line where nothing had scuffed. A pair of strides set deeper than the rest cut toward the far guy anchor and paused. The pads had left ovals, claws in small commas. Between 2 prints, the cinders showed a long, shallow drag like a forelimb had rested at an angle. The arc resumed past the far anchor, bending back toward the base of the tower, where the guy wire entered its clevis. Just then, the wind shifted 30 degrees, a subtle change that only people and trees notice. It made a low howl on the ridge to the east, an old, hollow sound shoved through rock teeth. The guy wire's note changed key, humming against the clevis like a bow laid to a single string. The presence, not a shape, only a weight made of ideas, eased off, as if the howl had argued better than I could. Back in the cab, the screen held a single coarse hair pulled through the mesh at an angle, caught in a weave like a dark thread. Hollow if you got it to the lamp right, guard length, winter grade, though it was late August. I left it. I log evidence. I don't pocket the night. The anemometer stalled at 0 while the shutters still talked, then jumped to 22, 24, 19. Numbers finding themselves again like a heartbeat after a held breath. The barometer blipped down and returned. I put both in the book, because the book forgives the way a person can't. From 1 to 3, the tower kept its steady plank breath, and the guy wires sang small, private hymns. Every so often, a shutter would click forward and rest, then back. The Aladard sight ring drifted twice and came home. The screen took one more polite push that I felt in my fingers on the frame rather than heard. I didn't offer light to any of it beyond what I needed to write, because light makes promises you sometimes can't keep. Near 4, the ranch light down valley went out, then on again. Someone checking a door for the same reasons I had. The ridge howl rose once more, and the wind swung back to its earlier angle. In the east, a pale wash started. Not dawn, just the idea of it. The radio carried a full sentence for the first time in hours. Dispatch to Kestrel, wind log through 0430, and any smokes over. I said, Kestrel copies, no smokes, gusts logged, and heard my voice come back small and correct. At 4:12, with starlight thinning, I made a last round. On the leeward shutters, a faint oily palm marked one board above my head height. Wide pads, finger tracks longer than my hand, dust caught in whirls that weren't human whirls. The mark pointed down, as if something had steadied itself to peer through the screen gap and decided against insisting. On the ladder, a smear on the rail could have been pitch or carryover from my own glove. I didn't decide. On the cinders, the wide arc prints still read clean, the rake marks bright in their edges. 2 fresh sets ran away north toward a saddle where a game trail drops off the backside. A patient 2x2 that liked the idea of the ground ring, but preferred ridge shadow to anything that hummed. When the sun finally showed its brass edge on a far pass, the tower turned to an object again, wood and metal and math, rather than a place a night thinks with you. I logged the last gusts, the anomalies, the screen hair, the cinder arcs, the shutter mark, the guy wire notes that came without gusts. I didn't write a name for the thing that kept my hours with me. I'm not paid to adjudicate legends. I'm paid to count wind and find smoke and keep my list clean enough that the next hand trusts what I saw. I brewed a small pot, the old blackened kettle rattling against a ring that never sits flat. When I opened the screen to let morning in, the hair in the mesh came loose on its own and blew away toward the saddle. A tiny dark line flipping end over end until the sun made it simple air. Below, the wide rake marks in the cinders still held their story. A note on a page the day would read until the first helicopter came and turned everything new with its downwash. The book looks ordinary if you don't know how to read its silences. Gust 28 max, 1 brief burrow dip, anemometer stall then recover, hasps moved and reset, guy wire note without gust, ladder rung tested, low chuff in the shaft, cinder arcs, shutter palm. A quiet night, it says, with wind. That's true. The wind had ideas, so did something else. Both decided by dawn that a tower could be left to do its job, and I did mine. Trash night on Alder Court has a ritual sound. Plastic wheels click over seams in the driveways. Lids thump softly. A porch light blinks on, then off, as if embarrassed to have helped. I couldn't sleep, so a little after midnight, I put on my reflective vest and decided to make a slow circle past the 6 houses and back. The HOA says we're all eyes for each other. Insomnia makes you volunteer. The street lamp at the bulb of the cul-de-sac throws a warm amber that doesn't care what month it is. The asphalt held a wet sheen from an earlier sprinkle, and fog lay thin at ankle height, the kind that makes your steps look like they belong to someone shorter. From behind the privacy fences came small neighborhood noises, an HVAC unit kicking on, a wind chime that didn't have wind, the distant whir of a garage fridge deciding to matter. Halfway down, I noticed the bins. Every wheelie can on the court had been pulled to the curb with the lids facing the street, which is ordinary, except they were lined with a neatness our HOA has never achieved. The front wheels of each had been set to the same angle, like their axles had taken marching orders. Mrs. Delaney leaves hers crooked. Tonight it pointed true. Mr. Cruz forgets to bring his out half the time. Tonight his bin stood proud and forward like a recruit. I told myself somebody's teenager had gone on an alignment spree. I told myself the HOA board would love the photo. I took one. My phone turned it into a fog-washed smear and decided to buffer. As I stepped by the 3rd house, a trash lid clicked and rose a hair. It wasn't the flap snap you hear when the spring decides to rebound. This was a slow lift, a plastic tongue pulled up and let down with care. On the lid center, 2 punctures sat far apart, spaced like fingertips from a hand that doesn't fit most gloves. Fresh white plastic showed in the holes, clean beads around each bite. The lid settled with a breath of sound instead of a slam. No raccoon does gentle. Raccoons don't reach that wide. On the curb opposite, condensation filmed the rear window of a sedan. At about 7 feet off the ground, a smear bisected the fog on the glass, a long strike that ran diagonally, as if a palm had rested there, while the other hand decided what to do. The fingers, longer than mine by a measure that made my wrist feel small, had left 5 pale lanes wiped clear through the moisture, each with a shallow crescent at the end where a claw must have thought better of its job. I kept the flashlight on low to save the night from argument. The reflective tape I'd stuck to my vest to keep cars honest showed me a different kind of glint farther up, 2 small points at canopy height inside the cedar's shadow. Not eyes. These were returns from something smooth, 2 narrow rectangles set side by side like a pair of markers facing the street. A strip of reflective tape, maybe, caught on a branch. Except they moved. A slow shift left and down in unison, then up, then apart into the black, where the tape should have stopped talking. The cedar breathed once and let them go. Behind the fence at 1:09, a panel bowed out and then relaxed, wood groaning quietly where screws took and returned. No slam, no dog bark, just a test of a boundary, the kind of push you give a door when you already know how it feels from the other side. A long breath moved the top edge of the fog where it touched the fence line. Plastic wheels did a tiny tick, tick, and stopped, as if a bin had been rolled 2 inches into perfect alignment and left to be proud of itself. I walked to the circle and turned so I could sweep the whole street back in a single view. The lamp hummed. One of the mailbox flags lifted and tipped back down. A second followed suit, like 2 hands trying to agree on a greeting. The air smelled faintly of damp cardboard and banana peels and something animal, not rank, not even unpleasant, more like wet fur that's seen winter, a clean musk with a metal penny edge. From the retention pond beyond the back fences came a low, hollow growl, amplified by the basin into a sound that felt larger than it likely was. Frogs would be done for the year. Geese don't make that note. I pictured a stray dog and didn't believe myself. I stood near the storm drain grate where kids chalk hopscotch in spring. The fog turned the cul-de-sac into a room. Somewhere behind me a trash bag moved without footfalls. Dragged, not lifted. No scraping. Just the friction whisper of thick plastic riding damp concrete. When I turned, a can lid eased chummed, that's it, tin, ease shut on its own. A hand you couldn't see had stopped caring whether it was open or closed. I told myself to narrate the ordinary. Possum, I said softly. Maybe a fox. The words didn't hold. My phone compass wandered 90 degrees when I checked it. Arrow swinging until it pointed at the pond and decided that was north tonight. The neighborhood cam app showed the familiar grid of doorbell views and then buffered into a row of grey squares that apologized with spinning circles. A porch cam at 111 flashed a hard infrared bloom, like a full-face glare, and then fell to black. On the far curb, a pair of plastic wheels rolled a polite 6 inches, tick, tick, and stopped, aligned exactly with the seam in the asphalt. The bin's shadow shifted a little, stretched by the lamp, and then became only itself. On my second pass, I saw the damp handprints. They weren't prints exactly, more like palm ovals laid in tar sheen, darker than the wet around them. Each the size of a dinner plate, spaced the length of a long stride apart along the street's crown. Not boot treads, no heel-toe story, just the suggestion of weight applied with hands where feet would be, and then retracted like a creature moving low with its hips high, deciding whether to stand and preferring not to. The fence panel at 115 bowed again, a full half-inch, then sighed back. A single long hair hung from a knot where the wood had splintered in some previous storm. Coarse, almost black, until the lamp turned it brown. Hollow, if you got it just right against the light. It stuck there, as if considering whether to fall into the yard. I stood, with my hands loose, and told the night what I could accept. Not tonight. Not this street. Take your food and go. It's foolish to think words help, but I've been human long enough to try them. A slow step sounded in the gravel where nobody was standing. 1, 2, moving behind the parked SUV, then silence. The condensation smear at 7 feet on the sedan window pulled a new, faint line, as if a nose had lowered and drawn a breath. The porch flood at 1:13 tripped hard and washed the yard white. In that light, nothing stood revealed. The flood made the fence knots look like eyes and returned me to myself. Down the hill a hiss grew. The first brake breath of the early garbage truck, making its way past the turnoff from the arterial. An orange beacon strobed once against the maples and set the fog blinking soft gold. The bins seemed to settle, an illusion of plastic and shadow. But I felt it like you feel a room exhale when conversation is over. The truck rolled in slow, lights throwing long bars across the cul-de-sac. The two-man crew did their careful ballet. The hopper sang its hydraulic hymn. Cans clattered and came back lighter. I raised a hand like a crossing guard, and the driver nodded, not surprised to see a reflective vest awake at 4. In the wash of the strobes, the condensation smear on the sedan looked like someone had cleaned it with a cloth and done a poor job. The mailbox flags lay down and pretended they'd never practiced. When the truck finished the circle, the driver braked and leaned out of his window. "You got coyotes again?" he asked, conversational, the way people become experts about streets they temporarily own. "Something like that," I said. "You see anything on your route?" He shook his head, eyes on the mirror like he liked his job too much to invent extra work. "Just weird putbacks tonight. A couple lids, like somebody doesn't know how hinges work." He grinned. "See you next Thursday." I watched the strobes amble out. The cul-de-sac returned to being a quiet round room with a humming lamp. The fence panel quit its ideas. The reflective pair up in the cedar didn't return. A small draft curled from the pond and smelled only like leaf water and old cattails. I made one last slow lap. The fingertip punctures in the plastic lid gleamed cleanly. The bins stayed proud. All wheels aligned. Lids face forward like a parade at attention even now that the point had passed. On the street crown, the palm ovals faded at their edges the way wet does when it decides to be road again. The long hair on the fence knot lifted, let go, and drifted down into the Delaney's ivy, vanishing so utterly that I didn't try to find it with my light. I went home by the shortest angle and sat on the bottom step with my shoes still on, the way you do when you want to be ready to go back out if the night asks. The HOA group chat pinged with a message at 4:41. Mrs. Cruz thanking the mystery neighbor who put her bin out for her. I didn't answer. I wrote a note in the little paper log I keep instead. All 6 bins pre-aligned, lid punctures far spaced, car condensation smear high, fence panel tested, reflective pair glint then move, bag drag, mailbox flags, palm ovals on tar, garbage truck arrival, presence breaks off. In the faint blue before sunrise, the court looked boring again. Real estate brochure normal. You could sell this cul-de-sac to anybody who likes the quiet life. It is quiet, We keep it that way. Some of us walk at night to help the quiet stay in place. Some nights, the quiet walks with you and puts the bins where it wants them, and then leaves without asking for thanks. That's a bargain I can make. Off-season, the boardwalk breathes like an old animal. Slats creak to the swell even when the water's calm. The sodium poles make their islands of tired orange, and between them the fog keeps its own rooms. I carry the ring of keys that sound like a bag of coins, a small LED on my belt, and the habit of locking every padlock twice in the winter, because ocean air convinces metal to dream. The arcade row sits dark till spring. Roll-down gates, prize counter wrapped in plastic, crane machines parked with their soft toys, looking away like they've been told to rest. My job is to walk the stretch from the candy stand to the fishing pier, note anything that would make the city nervous, and bleed the breakers once a week so the circuits remember they're alive. Just shy of 1, the tide sat low and thinking about turning. The air had that mix you get only here: cold salt, old popcorn fat, a hint of bleach from the mop sink. Gulls talk at night when they want to. Tonight, they'd been stitching the fog with little laughs and insults. As I lifted the gate on the breaker closet, they stopped in the same second, like somebody had taught them a cue. I didn't rush. I flipped the first arcade row on to 6%. The dim test that makes the exit signs glow and the cabinets hum without waking the neighborhood. Light pooled under the roll-down seams and showed me dust I should have swept more often. On the prize crane glass, a high smudge angled from left top down toward the middle. Not the squeegee S the day crew leaves, but a long palm with finger tracks that trailed into fogged arcs and ended as if claws had been placed carefully rather than dragged. The smudge sat higher than I remember seeing kids' handprints, maybe 7.5 feet up the panel. No storm tonight, I told myself. Condensation and someone tall in boots in October. Old Mark saying it didn't make it true. Ticket strings on the floor. Those paper ladders you tear and hand to birthday kids, stirred against still air. Not a draft. Not the lazy spin when fans cycle. They crawled inch by inch like something under the counter had breathed out through the gap, and the flow found the paper and taught it to move. I watched the strip hook around the coin pusher's leg in a slow U and lie there as if it had changed its mind. Out beyond the arcade front, the boardwalk slats clicked twice in quick sequence. Not my steps, not the linear creak of the tide. 2 taps with a weight behind them, then nothing. Farther down by the pier, a nav lamp made a calm green. Something passed between me and that green without showing itself. The way a big shape edits fog rather than emerging from it. It went left to right and was gone, as if it preferred to be made of what it erased. I rolled the gate down on the breaker closet and made the back of house run. The fishing club keeps a net shed behind the last game row. Its padlock sits at my eye and takes a little jiggle. When I turned the corner, the roll-down gate on the prize stall bowed inward a full inch, and then relaxed, the slats making that long whisper gate metal makes when it thinks about giving. No wind ran that corridor. I cupped the LED and let it make a small circle so the dark wouldn't feel challenged. Under the pier, the pilings talked to each other. Soft knocks, low and slow. Not the slap of loose rope or a skiff's painter. The sound ran along the line from oceanside to bayside and paused under where the dumpster enclosure shadows the sand. I smelled salt like a penny, fresh and metallic. Not just the usual ocean flat. The hair on my wrist lifted. That doesn't make a person special, just air honest. I cut across to the crane line because the smudge had made me uneasy. And uneasy is the alarm the job pays you to respect. Fog condensed on the glass and tried to hide the mark, but my little circle of light found it again. Palm wide as a saucer, finger tracks a little curved, ending in 5 soft half-moons that could be cleverly trimmed nails if you needed the world to remain ordinary. On the sill, someone had left 2 tokens in a neat pair, edges touching, old brass style, stamped with a lighthouse, laid, not dropped. Kids leave singles and piles. Pairs aligned feel like a note for whoever reads such things. I turned toward the pier to check the nav lamp column and paused at a wet set of slats. On the algae stain that marks high splash, 2 ovals of darker wet sat offset, as if something had braced there with hands a moment before it chose to be somewhere else. Not boot tread, not the skate shoes the teens wear when they practice at midnight. Ovals with a hint of pad at the front and a comma where a claw might touch if asked. I told myself to make lists rather than names. Gate bowed 1 inch. Ticket strings moved without fan. Crane glass high smudge with finger arcs. Paired tokens. Damp ovals in algae. The list calms the wild out of a thing long enough for you to do decent work. On the pier, the nav lamps hold a rhythm against the breathing of the ocean. You can feel when something breaks that rhythm without touching a hand to the post. The green down the line hiccuped, once, twice, then steadied with a little buzzing temper. Between lamps, a shadow crossed where the pier's catwalk opens to let old fishermen step down to low tide. It had the length of a runner and the posture of a thing that knows it can drop onto the sand with more legs than you have and be gone before the light calls your eyes back. I didn't chase it. I set my boots on wood and kept them honest. Gulls broke their pact with silence for a second, a few quick scolds, and then clamped down again, as if a teacher had entered the room. Inside, the coin pusher made a sound I haven't heard with the back off in months. A soft slide, a stack moving forward, coins rolling in miniature like a tide on metal. The motor wasn't running. The power was a test. The playfield sat still. The stack had shifted on its own, and a single token kissed the plexi with a click that should have made me smile, but didn't. On the floor by the coin door, a ticket string curled around my boot, as if it had been looking for one. I gave the pier legs one more listen and heard a long, low chuff. The breath a big dog makes through its nose when it wants information more than attention. It rode the surf roar and found my ears anyway. The roll-down gate nearest the sound flexed at the bottom, just a bow in the last inch, then came back the way a muscle does when the set passes. My phone camera tried to help and failed. Focus breathed in and out on the fog and then decided the world was too soft for truth tonight. I put it away. Some nights you earn your memory. Time passes different when the ocean does its counting for you. I checked hinges, felt for loose screws, wrote repaint needed on a list the city would delay until May. Every 20 minutes I came back to the crane line to see if the high smudge learned anything. It didn't learn. It insisted. At 4:23, the tide turned hard enough that the pilings changed their voices. Higher wood talk, more urgency, different math. The gulls resumed their little conversations in a clatter at first, and then in routine arguments about nothing. With their noise came the sense that something else had made its decision. The shadow past the nav lamp did not return. The gate didn't bow again. Ticket strings lay like paper ought to, waiting for someone to throw them away. I walked down to the sand via the access stairs to read the ground before the day's first walker scuffed it. The beach at low turn keeps secrets badly. 2x2 prints came from the rack line up to the first run of planks. Long stride for sand, pads deep, claw tips pressed but not gouged. The pair paused where the algae stains darkened the wood, and the damp ovals I'd seen on the slats matched the story. Then the prints went sidewise along the pier shadow, and thinned into the place where water starts to write over what you thought you had. I picked a strand of coarse hair off the bottom lip of the gate nearest the pier stairs. Salt had damped it heavy. When I pinched it, I felt the hollow the way you do with winter coats built for things that don't own houses. I set the hair back on the lip because some nights you let the ocean take what belongs to it. By the time the lighthouse suite paled to nothing in the greying fog, the arcade's exit signs looked silly and polite again. I bled the breakers back to off, heard each cabinet's transformer give its tiny goodbye, rolled the closet door down and locked it twice because second times are for courtesy. The tokens on the crane sills stayed in their pair, an offering or a joke, depending on who you are. I didn't take them. I wrote them down. When I turned toward the fishing pier, the nav lamps kept their rhythm and the catwalk showed only the hose loops and the damp marks you expect. A gull laughed and then remembered it was morning. The boardwalk slats still creaked because they enjoy it. I made the last pass with the LED barely on and the keys quieter than they'd been all night. The list reads clean when you don't look between lines. Gulls silence all at once. Gate bowed and released. Ticket strings moved. Coin pusher slid without motor. High smudge on crane glass. Paired tokens. Damp ovals on algae line. 2x2 prints up onto the planks. Single chuff over surf. Presents thinned with tide turn and first grey. I can live with that. I'll call the painter to bring a longer pole for spring. I'll sweep the ticket strings. I'll oil the gate tracks, and I'll keep the dim test to 6% and no more. Some light belongs to the ocean, some to us. Nights like this, both of us keep our share. The ridge keeps its own weather even on clear nights. Down in town, the air smelled like wood smoke and fryer grease. Up here, it was rock and cold metal, and the faint ozone of things that talk to each other across distance. The alarm on Site 74 had come through near midnight, a transient trap storm that quieted before the NOC could get a second look. So I took a key set and a thermos, and made the 40-minute climb to put eyes on it. The stars had that hard winter look, like someone had washed them in ice water. I left the truck nose out below the chain link and cleared the padlock with hands that didn't want to learn a new combination at 12:37 a.m. The gate rolled just enough to let me through. The compound is a square of gravel and basalt, a prefab equipment shelter with humming cabinets, a generator hut that hates praise, and a microwave tower with a dish big enough to listen to the next county breathe. The first odd thing wasn't sound, it was feel. The top rail on the chain link flexed a fraction and then set, like someone taller than me had used it to test balance. The razor wire above it murmured the way dry grass does when a hand passes over it deliberately. No wind worth naming ran the ridge. The night held still. I did the perimeter once with the headlamp on low, and the world the color of basalt. The tower beacon ticked its low-intensity red like a polite heartbeat. On the RF warning placard bolted to a post at the base. White background, big blue field with the stylized "Don't be here without training." A palm smear sat higher than I could reach, oily and dusty in the beam. 5 long fingers angled slightly, as if a tall thing had steadied itself to peer into a world it didn't belong to. The worlds weren't human. They weren't anything a glove would choose to imitate. Inside the shelter, the air carried that warm plastic server smell. The cabinet LEDs made a little constellation. Fans stacked their steady hiss into a noise that becomes silence when you stop trying to name it. I jacked into the site console. Graphs showed the alarm spike I'd driven for. 6 minutes of insanity, then a plateau of innocence. The cursor lagged my hand, then caught up all at once, printing 3 minutes of logs in a rush like a kid who just remembered his homework. Outside, something brushed the chain link from end to end with the long patience of a body that liked knowing about fences. I stepped out to the generator hut and checked the ATS panel. Exercise was scheduled for 3 a.m. The unit would spin itself awake whether I cheered it on or not. The hut's cinder blocks held the day's heat like a friendly dog. Somewhere beyond the fence, decomposed granite made a sound you know if you hike out here. The soft grit whisper of weight taking a careful step, and then deciding a second would be smarter. The parabolic dish above me shifted in a way that dishes don't at rest. Not wind gust, not thermal creep. A very slow, very small yaw, like a person testing a shoulder and realizing someone is watching. The azimuth indicator didn't move. The dish mouth pointed past me at the dark, and the dark offered back a low chuff that the curve of aluminum caught and settled in my chest. Not a bark, not cats. A canine clearing breath, quiet enough to be polite, large enough to be my only company. I put my hand on the chain link gate because gates have a memory for you if you touch them. The top rail didn't flex again. The razor wire whispered once and then remembered it was metal. I walked the gravel strip to the cable trough that runs from the tower pad to the shelter. One fiberglass cover sat skewed over its pocket, shifted 2 inches off line with no boot scuff on the dust. Beneath, coaxed the width of a wrist hummed a hair out of tune. The vibration just different enough that my palm read it like a plucked string left to die. Back inside, I ran quick checks. Forward error rates, link margin, rectifier temps, battery float. Numbers wore their Sunday best. When the SNMP traps had flared earlier, they touched every cabinet at once like a hand dragging along a row of fence posts. Transient, then quiet, the log said. Weird, then normal, my notes say now. At 1:48, the compound floods blinked once, the tiniest hiccup in the circuit that didn't come from my hand. I stepped out to see if a breaker had sweated. The chain link looked like chain link again. The top rail bore a dull shine where hand taller than mine don't usually polish. Along the bottom of the fence line, the granite had taken 2 pad ovals deep enough to hold their edges in the cold. Not hoof, not boot. A common nick at the front of each said claw-kissed rock and didn't need to cut it. I gave the world a little less beam and took the long side to the helipad. The reflectors set into the concrete stared up like cat eyes. 2 had been rotated a quarter turn to match each other in a way the maintenance crew never bothers to perfect. I righted one with a thumb and let the small satisfaction live in me a second. When I turned back, an unopened Desiccant pack from the shelter, little white pouch that says, "Do not eat" in a dozen languages, lay on the pad where I hadn't left it. A second later, it wasn't unopened. The pouch had been torn at 2 wide points like lips learning a trick, and silica spilled in an arc that pattered like tiny hailstones across concrete. I could smell the faint chemical dust, not sharp, just wrong enough to be a note. I stood and listened to how ordinary machines sound when they're nervous. The generator hut made that pre-test belly growl some brands do when the block heater cycles. The tower gave its little beacon tick. The coax rack hum shifted up half a cent, then back, as if someone had plucked it behind my shoulder. At 2:59, the auto test spun the compound into a small sunrise. The generator coughed, thought better of dying, and settled. Floodlights crashed on along the fence line, washing the gravel and basalt in clean white. The shadow that had been near the dish folded into the gap at the outer corner like fabric shot with a rubber band. The razor wire whispered once more, quieter now, then held its breath. I let the exercise run its 8 minutes. In that wash of civilized light, the place looked silly for thinking about monsters. The Desiccant beads glittered like a school science project on the pad. The RF placard's high palm smear looked like nothing but oily dust again. The chain-link top course had no reason to know fear or flex. That's what light is for. When the ATS handed load back and the site returned to utility, the floods timed out. I let my headlamp make the night small again, and I walked the perimeter one more slow time. On a razor barb near the corner, a tuft of long coarse hair had snagged. A winter guard hair with a hollow center you can see if you roll it just so. I left it where the wind could decide its future. Past the tower legs, the granite held 2 new pad ovals, then none. The stride angling off toward a patch of black brush and broken rock. A long body must have brushed the fence on its way. Gravel had a neat line dragged through it at chain-link height. Not boot, not tool. Inside, the console had caught up to itself entirely. The trap storm looked like a story the site wanted to tell, and then felt embarrassed about. I wrote the words I'd want to read if it were my morning. Visual inspect and OK. Chain-link top rail flexed earlier. High palm smear on RF sign. Desiccant pack torn/spill. Coax rack hum altered, now nominal. Flood auto test coincided with cessation of perimeter noise. No service impact. When I killed the shelter work light to step out for the last time, the world arranged itself the way machines like it. Beacon ticking, cabinets humming, generator smug. The ridge gave a small cat's paw of breeze down the basalt, and it tasted like cold tin and sage. Stars leaned in close as if they approved of lists. Before I locked the gate, I pressed the top rail with my palm. It didn't flex. It felt like a rail, round, cold, ordinary. The razor wire above it didn't sing. Somewhere beyond my beam, decomposed granite whispered once more. Not closer, not farther. Just the ridge reminding me I was the visitor, and then quiet. Back at the truck, I sat with the thermos open, watching my breath fog the windshield until the defroster won. I put the site key back on the ring and told the NOC what they liked to hear. All green, just a quirky night. My notebook has the extra lines. Chain-link flex, high palm, dish yaw, coax like a string, silica hail, chuff in the dish mouth, floods flare, and the world remembers what it's supposed to be. That's enough truth to carry. The rest belongs to a ridge where signals jump county lines, and something else keeps pace with fences until the light asks it to leave. Wastewater plants have their own hush. It's not quiet. Motors hum, blowers breathe. Little rattles argue about bolts. But the sum of it turns into a steady room tone that forgives you for being there. The Riverside pump station is the river's basement. Bar screen room with damp tile. Grit tanks huffing under steel decking. The wet well below like a slow lung. My phone had thrown a nuisance alarm around midnight. Door contact flutter on the overflow gate enclosure. So I came in with coffee and the kind of patience you bring to equipment that lies. I signed the log, keyed into the bar screen room, and let my headlamp live on low. The overhead sodiums make everything tan and tired, My H2S handheld read 0 and kept a lazy blink. The big screen rake was between cycles, teeth shining like exhausted piano keys. River mist reached in under the exterior door gaps and made the tile sweat. The first odd thing was so small, I could have ignored it. A manhole lid out on the apron shivered without a truck on the street. Not a full chatter, just the lid's iron lip, kissing its seat twice. The exterior flood by the overflow gate threw a slice of white across it. The circle glinted and went still. I told myself a pressure wobble had hiccuped a column of air somewhere in the relief tunnel. The words did their job for about a minute. SCADA. On the fly on the wall showed our pump amps doing nothing interesting, and the wet, well-level edging down like it should. Then the trend line flatlined for 30 seconds. No change, no noise, just a screen forgetting to breathe, before it caught up all at once and drew the missing path in a tilted rush. The door contact alarm. Client's alarm fluttered again. Closed, open, closed, as if the gatehouse had blinked. I walked the steel grating above the grit tanks. The metal spoke a low, honest song under my boots. Halfway over, the grating took a step that wasn't mine. One slow press and release that carried under my feet like a body matching me from the other side of the panel. I stopped and let the station settle around me. Air moved down the duct in a smooth inhale. In that breath rode the low chuff of a big dog who wants to smell what you've brought. Not a dog, I said softly, because it helps to contradict your own brain. Back in bar screen, the rake chose to wake without waiting for the timer. Chain started, rake dipped, teeth descended, and halfway down the ladder of trash it stalled with a metallic throat clear that turned into a stubborn quiet. The overload didn't trip. The rake simply held. Out past the splash guard, a handful of shredded wipes hung in a slow sway like seaweed. I thumbed the jog and the rake sighed itself free and finished the cycle, setting its load into the dumpster with a polite thump. The chain guard where the ladder curves held a single long hair, black until the sodium turned it brown, coarse enough to feel stiff through nitrile. I left it where it was. You don't take trophies from rooms that breathe. The odor control scrubber grumbled the way it does when it eats sulfur for a living. My H2S handheld spiked to 21 parts per million, a number that would make a foreman yell, and then fell back to flat 0 in 2 seconds. Nothing smells can vanish that fast in a room that size. I tapped the sensor like that could reform physics. The display blinked a face it shows when it thinks you're being dramatic. On the cinder block, by the confined space permit required sign, 3 feet above my head by the door to the overflow gate, a damp smear angled down, palm wide, finger tracks long, tailing into little sickle marks where something claw-like had been set gently and lifted. The slime line on the tile ran at chest height like always, but above it another line traced fresh, 4 inches higher, faint as a whisper. A slide, as if something tall had steadied itself along the wall, with a hand because tile is slick when you're learning it. Down at the wet well side glass, the river's smell came up thicker. Iron and leaf rot, and that not rot wastewater plants tame for a living. The river was high from last week's rain, but steady. The level bobbed. Somewhere in the tunnel downstream, a pipe knocked. 3 slow taps in a deliberate pattern, then 5, then 3 again. Not air slugs, not water hammer. It sounded like someone talking through iron. The exterior door contact chirped open and kept it for a count of 4 before saying closed again. I went to the gate enclosure because if something is actually fighting that panel, my signature will own it at sunrise. The painted wheel on the sluice gate had a quarter turn of fresh scar through the red, bright metal showing under the varnish, where a hand had tested it and put it back. My glove came away with a faint, oily film that smelled like river and dog. From the relief tunnel, a breath came in and ate my headlamp beam at the edges, the way fog does when it's not fog, but a colder draft woven with a different temperature of air. The chuff came again in that breath, deeper. The duct above me carried it and pitched it like a low flute note. I didn't turn every light on. I let the building keep most of its night. If you light the corners too much, the corners start making promises they have no intention of keeping. I did, however, bump the SCADA klaxon test down to enabled, because surprises belong to the human who can choose them. At 2:37, the manhole lid outside shivered again, 3 kisses this time, and settled Zard. CCTV over the apron tried to help, and fogged on the inside of its dome, the kind of condensation you only fix with a ladder and warmer weather. In the grit room, the auger guard rattled like someone had run a finger along its perforations and then set it back with the care of a person who tidies for company. I took the long way back to the bar screen and saw the pads. Across the damp concrete, from the doorway to the screen dumpster, 2 by 2 ovals read darker than the wet around them. Not boot. Not a raccoon's neat hand. Big pads, claws kissed down at the front like little commas. The stride was long enough to make my knees feel like they belonged to a shorter species. Each print had a tiny arc of water fling. Evidence the foot had left the floor with more intention than a smear. My handheld hissed its reminder that at 0 parts per million it can't be your conscience. I held it up anyway, like a priest with a radio. We're fine, I told either it or myself. Pipe knock answered, with a different pattern. Tap, 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 tap. Water doesn't play Morse, not even for night shift. The sound came from the relief tunnel throat, deep and patient, like a hand exploring rivets on an old plate and finding a tempo. The overflow gate wheel twitched a quarter turn again and came back. The red lost another little crescent of paint, bright steel glaring. I didn't reach for it. I kept my hand open where anything could see it and hear the logic of human palms. I set the klaxon to arm and stepped to the SCADA panel. The system didn't care about my heart rate. It cared about pump sequence and amps. At 3 o'clock exactly, Pump 2 was due to kick for a short surge to clear rag nests. I let the timer run without manual help. In the 20 seconds before the surge, the room went still. The kind of still that makes every small sound feel foreground. The bar screen chains ticked as if they remembered something. A slow step pressed the grating again under me, though I wasn't over the tanks anymore, just like before. One careful wait said where my body's shadow would have been if there had been light to make one. Then the klaxon hit. The red beacon spun. The siren threw its square wave into tile and ducting and bone, and Pump 2 came to life like a train takes the block. Intake roar rising, air purging, water's voice becoming a muscle. The relief tunnel coughed and chose its own direction. The pipe knock stopped. The chuff lost its home. I felt the grating relax. The wheel on the overflow gate refused to twitch anything but my imagination. The manhole lid outside sat like iron. My H2S handheld stayed at 0 because the universe had decided to be boring again. I let the klaxon time out and the pump finish its minute. With the room loud, whatever had shared the room chose the river instead. The CCTV cleared its dome, perhaps because warm air from the pump gallery kissed it on the inside and made it useful honestly for once. The trend line on SCADA remembered to be a line instead of a panic. The door contact settled. The building made the noise buildings make when they agree to be machines. Evidence doesn't care what you believe. The high smear on the permit required sign still angled down, its shine drying at the edges. On the chain guard, where the bar screen ladder curves, the coarse hair clung until surface tension gave up, and it fell, sticking to the wet like a dark hyphen. On the damp concrete by the dumpster, two of the pad ovals held long enough to read, and then softened their edges, as if the night preferred not to be sighted in the morning. A small quarter-moon nick of bare steel showed on the red paint of the gate wheel where bright had replaced old. Up in the door jamb of the gate enclosure, my glove smudge overlapped something else's oil in a way that made me glad for the lie of nitrile. I wrote my lines for the book. Nuisance door contact, no entry, SCADA lag then catch up. Bar screen rake paused mid-cycle, then cleared. H2S handheld. Momentary spike to 21 parts per million, then 0. Observed damp pad impressions. Overflow gate wheel shows fresh scuff. Klaxon plus surge at 3 a.m. coincided with cessation of anomalies. I did not write the pipe knocking in patterns, though I remember those beats like a song I don't plan to hum where anyone can hear it. On my way out at a little after 4, the river breathed its big river breath, and the mist came in a ribbon through the apron like a friendly ghost. The manhole lid didn't move. The flood by the gate made a white triangle on the concrete that nothing crossed. Somewhere down the relief tunnel, water spoke in its old language about gravity and slope, and nothing else. Out in the truck, with the defroster turning the windshield back into glass, I touched the handheld one more time to watch the 0 blink. I believed it because believing useful lies lets you go home. The sleeve of my jacket held the faintest smell of wet fur and metal. I left the window cracked and drove along the river, where the city keeps sleeping with all the ways it stays alive, humming under it like a promise you don't have to make alone. Resorts look smaller at night. The runs fold inward. The trees take the hill back in long, dark combs. The lift towers stand like quiet arguments you don't have to settle until morning. I'd taken the temp night shift to bring the old double chair back from shoulder season, check the heaters on the drive, nurse the control board out of its sulk, and see whether the bull wheel felt like company. 4 hours, a thermos, a toolbox, and snow that pretended to be more than flurries whenever the headlamp got involved. The maintenance shack smelled like chain lube and damp plywood. The fluorescent flickered into that fish tank glow and coughed itself steady. Outside, the bull wheel house wore its sheet metal rattle like an old winter coat. The haul rope hung low and sensible over the empty maze. Each chair turned slightly by habit and wind. The breeze at the base drifted politely at 2 or 3 miles an hour, enough to make the map flap against its stand, not enough to cool anything gust. On the control panel, the status lights lagged a second behind the toggles. Old relay boards thinking about whether to agree. I tapped a knuckle on the dead man switch because ritual feels like help, even when it isn't. The RFID gate reader at the corral woke its little screen, blinked a card icon like a child practicing, and went back to sleep without anyone to impress. The first odd thing was the chair sway. You learn wind patterns at the lift without meaning to. The line breathes in sets, a down valley sigh moves the first 10 chairs, and the movement runs up tower like someone nudged a string of keys. This wasn't that. Chair 12 swung a hair against the breeze, then held, then tapped back in a rhythm so calm it felt chosen. The breeze kept its steady lean out of the north. Chair 12 disagreed twice more at the same slow count and stopped. Winter memory, I told myself, and wrote Inspect 12 hanger bolt on my list, because writing the ordinary over a strange moment buys you time. On the bull wheel hand wheel, someone had left last season's chalk line where true meets true after you set the brake test. My line sat neat on its mate when I came back from the tower number 1. Foot to chip ice. The line sat a quarter turn off, bright metal showing a tiny crescent on the spoke where paint had rubbed clean. The brake hadn't released. The main hadn't budged. Only the hand wheel told me someone thoughtful had tried and then put it exactly back, like they didn't want to be rude to old settings. Roof snow sat shallow on the shack, dusting that silky kind you can hear if you listen. No sound at all, but more of a feeling inside your ears when it settles. It settled in 2 soft segments. Thup, thup, spaced like steps across the roof ridge. I told myself thermal fluff does that. I told myself this tin box breathes. I still looked up even though there was nowhere to look to. The haul rope made a creak that wasn't rope drying. It was the sound of weight asking a sheave to consider itself, then deciding not to take the argument further. Not a full groan. Not enough to move the line. Just that whisper of steel talking to steel when it remembers bodies and finds none. I stepped out with my headlamp on low and made the short walk along the cat track to tower number 1. The corduroy left by the last groom in March had frozen into shallow ribs with a night's dust of new on top. No wind scoured here. The trees kept their windbreak promise. At the edge of the light, a shadow kept pace with me, not on the track but just beyond it where the scrub pokes through. The kind of outline that doesn't make a shape you can name, only a subtraction from snow that learns to be noticed. The ladder up the tower felt colder than the air. Halfway, a rung answered with a press that wasn't my boot. It shifted a hair, then set. The tower didn't care about belief. It gave the truth of a momentary extra weight, and then decided to pretend. Back at the shack, the bull-wheel service light put a yellow halo on the line, and in it, the foam on 2 of the double chairs showed new rakes. Long, widely spaced scrapes across the seat, as if a hand with patience, and the wrong set of nails had tested the texture. The beads of disturbed snow at the edges caught my light and tried to glitter like they were proud of themselves. I set a glove finger to the foam, and it squeaked. The marks were shallow, deliberate, not the chew of porcupines or the bored mischief of teenagers with keys. The lift maze ropes had been a lazy zigzag when I arrived, the way the spring wind leaves them. Now their posts stood straight in a line, the ropes running arrow true, as if a manager with a clipboard had laid them out for first chair. I'm the kind of person who would do that to feel like a small order had been imposed. I'm also the kind who admits when he did not. In the shack window, outside, high enough that I would have had to stand on a milk crate to match it, a palm smear angled down the glass, a wide pad with 5 long finger trails, each ending in a gentle comma where something harder had nested and lifted. The prints sat on the outer frost. Crystals had grown around the ridges as if the smear had been there minutes, not hours. The radio on my chest carried only a carrier, no voice. I offered, base 2 to cat 7, you running tonight? To the silence, because hearing my own voice makes me more aware of what it sounds like when I don't use it. The speaker breathed and refused. I put my hands where machines like to see them, on the edge of the control panel with my fingers away from switches. and I let the night try its next idea. From under the ball wheel came a low chuff that the curve of the housing caught and returned. It rode the little maintenance light the way breath rides cold, visible only when you try not to see. The handwheel's chalk marks kissed true again, meeting as neat as if a careful line worker had put them home and patted them soft. I had not touched it. The roof snow settled once more. One quiet step, and then the other, and then the kind of stillness you get when a big animal decides stillness is the right shape for a minute. I did my lists. Heaters, on and honest. Drive cabinet, hum within reason. Slack rope switch, latch is clean. I wrote the numbers with a pencil that kept wanting to split at the point, because cold wood is dramatic. When I opened the shack door to step back out, the smear on the glass caught the fluorescent flicker and made a soft glare around the pad, like a halo you'd give a saint who likes the smell of fur. Down by the corral, chair 12 did its slow disagreement again. Left against the breeze, hold, right tap, stop. You could set a metronome by it. The rope between the posts hung with a slight bow that remembered hands. Near the far cone, where the exit is in February, the cat track crust held a pair of prints, 2 by 2, long stride for this run, pads deep enough to hold edges through a dusting, claws registered as commas that took only the top grain of snow with them. They led from the corral shadow to the maze ropes, paced the line like someone checking tapes, and veered toward the woods where the cat road rises. I let myself have the groomer in my future. Cat'll come by, I told the air. He'll set a fresh pass and the world will be normal again. I didn't know if the cat had even been called. A minute later, the lift maze rope post shifted a 1/4 inch, the kind of collective straighten a line does when you tug it once at the end and trust friction to carry the instruction. The breeze kept it small, true lean. The line obeyed something else. I kept the headlamp low and gave the night my back, because some postures are useful to both parties. Behind me, the haul rope creaked again, with a sigh of imaginary weight. Upslope, between towers number 2 and number 3, something crossed the gap where the floodlight on number 1 throws a triangle into the playground of dark. It moved like a runner who knows talus and hates showmanship. Long through the shoulders, narrow through the middle, head carried too forward to be a person, ears up. No eyes shone. The light didn't want to make that trouble. The silhouette edited the snow light for 3 beats and was gone. I heard my father's voice from years before, telling me about night animals that live on posture and choices, not arguments. I kept my posture and chose not to argue. The control panel did its lag and dump trick again, spill of status lights catching up like a nervous friend. The RFID gate reader woke and slept. The radio gave me a breath and then a half syllable. Even. That could have been Stephen, if you believe my name is how the mountain knows me. I set the radio back on its clip because a heart doesn't need that polite lie to quicken. Time folded the way it does when snow mutters and mechanics hum. I checked chair 12's hanger bolt with a wrench to dignify my first excuse. It was tight. The hanger arm held a new bright nick where something hard had tapped it with gentleness. Snow drifted an extra 1/4 inch while I pretended the nick was from a ladder last spring. When I stepped back, the foam on the seat showed a 3rd rake across the old 2, same spacing, a little deeper, as if the first opinion had been reconsidered. Far down valley, a tremor of engine. Snowcats have a voice that carries loving distance. When the air is this clean, I didn't call the driver. I didn't raise the radio. I let the mountain count the seconds the way it counts tree trunks between gusts. Lights came up the cat road like small moons arguing about who got to go first. The rumble grew into the kind of steady that makes snow feel safe. Chair 12 swung once directly with the breeze and wasn't stubborn about it. The hand-wheel chalk stayed true and decided not to practice tricks. In the waver of the approaching beams, the shadow along the road edge folded itself into the trees, the way a large dog chooses underbrush when it gives you the trail. The groomer rolled through the base and gave a curt horn, because off-season is manners with machines. The headlights washed the maze ropes and turned my prints into a pattern that belongs to whoever runs hydraulics. The cat made a wide, loving turn by the corral, said a thoughtful pass along tower number 1, and climbed without hurry to number 2 like the hill was listening. In the light, the corduroy told on everything. I saw 2 long strides glimmer where Prince had pressed the ribbed snow newer and the cat hadn't met them yet. 2 neat pairs, no boot scallop, no heel story. By the time the blade reached them, they smoothed into those little waves cats are paid to make. When the groomer cleared number 3 and the night settled into the hum that machines leave behind, I walked the maze one last time. On the rope by the cone, a coarse hair had snagged at a twist. Dark until my light made it brown, hollow, when I turned my headlamp to catch the center. On the handwheel spoke. The fresh bright scuff was the size of a thumbnail and honest. In the foam, the rakes caught a dusting of new that began to soften their edges like the hill wanted to heal. I wrote my lines for the morning. Heater's good. Panel lagged, then dumped. Normal old board. RFID sleepy. Chair 12 sway. Inspect during day. Handwheel chalk offset / returned. Spoke has fresh scuff. Foam rakes on chairs 12 to 13. Maze rope straightened. Ladder rung field tower number 1 check bolts. Groomer pass at 3:32. Thanks. I did not write presence disliked engine light, though the mountain and I both knew it. Before I killed the shack lamps, I cupped the window smear with my glove and left it alone. Outside, the run dimmed back to its silver and grey. The chairs held still like patient punctuation. The breeze remembered north and kept to it. Somewhere between towers, snow settled with that ear-inside sound again, and didn't feel like footsteps anymore, only winter. I locked the shack, pocketed the pencil that had finally learned to write, and stood a minute to listen to the bull-wheel house breathe. When I walked down the cat road, the corduroy took my boots like it had been waiting for feet it could explain. Behind me, the lift took itself into the quiet story it tells when nobody's riding it. Rope singing the ghost of weight, towers humming a low note, chairs making small private agreements with air. At the corral fence, the coarse hair lifted in a tiny wind and let go, drifting into the webbing of the rope like a line returning to a page. The mountain doesn't sign for you. It initialed the night anyway.